Meanwhile, the enemy did not let us forget his presence. Moreover, it was felt that he was coming closer and closer. Now from the German sector we could constantly hear the sounds of Russian machine gun bursts, which the Germans answered with the fierce fire of their rapid-fire MG-34s. The shells fired from the Russian mortars were falling everywhere. Now it was no longer possible to walk 100 meters through the city without discovering somewhere a new black crater. German guns and mortars, placed between houses in all parts of the city, were returning fire. The last surviving window frames shook from the nearby explosions. Several German mortars were positioned just in front of our house, among the ruins of a building destroyed quite some time ago. Their shells rose into the air with a sharp, piercing and at the same time lilting sound unlike anything we had heard so far. The Russians quickly figured out where they were firing from and often tried to cover that point with their fire. How many shells exploded around us? The period of relative calm that we had enjoyed during the first days after our arrival in Chertkovo was over. We had to think about death again, and it was clearly looming nearby. As a matter of fact, we had already become accustomed to the constant company of Kostlivar, who accompanied us inexorably on the march. Whenever we heard the squeal of shells flying over our heads and the rattle of bursts, we always began to calm Candela. It was not good for him to worry. The poor man had only just begun to walk. He had frostbite on the tip of his nose and 3 or 4 fingers, which were likely to be amputated. The poor man had long been the object of our untiring care. In those days, the century I mentioned earlier was being created. There were only about 500 rifles and muskets for the many thousands of Italians who got to Chertkovo. Most of the officers also had pistols. Thus 2 or 3 centuries were created. I had no intention of returning to the front line until my legs were finally healed. I confess I found it easy to justify my selfishness. After all, there are plenty of officers here. Why should I be the one to go out into the horrible cold again? If I was to die, I'd rather die in the warmth. The truth was that the horrors we had experienced had dulled our perceptions and made our souls indifferent to everything, including our sense of duty. Perhaps God is punishing me for my former conceit. The creation of Century, like everything we did, was spontaneous and disorderly. I had the opportunity to see once again. We Italians are quite organized when everyone acts on his own, but completely hopeless when it comes to collective organization. It seemed that no one could bring order. Thinking of our peaceful life in Italy, which was undoubtedly well organized with people easily subject to civilian discipline, I never ceased to wonder how we had managed to achieve it. In our group, only one Valorzi volunteered to enter one of the Century. He repeatedly and indignantly spoke out against those who were obliged, in his opinion, to be first on the list of volunteers, but he preferred to stay away. Valorzi never changed his mind. He was accustomed to follow through on everything. Every single soldier in our house followed him. Over time, I tracked down many officers and soldiers from my 30th Brigade. One of the first I met was a captain who, as before, thought only of himself. He was matched by a doctor who pretended to be sick all the time to avoid helping the many wounded and frostbitten who were literally flooding the city. These egoists to the bone, nothing could not get through. What we lacked most in Chertkov was medical personnel. There were a few enthusiastic people, but they did not have the energy to help anyone who needed it. I met San Martino again, and also Carletti, my good front-line friend. He had taken up residence in a wing of the large building behind headquarters with many Vecchi from the 2nd Battery, including the former head of the food hall, Captain Pontoriero. Commander of the 3rd Battery, was also with them. How glad we were to find each other again. Although our frowning, exhausted faces expressed little hope of getting out of this mess alive. Carletti told me where Bona and Cinci were. Little by little it became clear that there were many men from the 30th Brigade scattered around Chertkov. In those last days of the year, Bellini and Antonini, whom I had visited in the infirmary, moved into our house. With them came Sergeants Breda and Pilone, both from Bellini's group. It was impossible to stay in the infirmary. Its rooms, as well as the corridor, were crowded with wounded and frostbitten, lying on top of each other. Only one, the smallest room, remained free. In it, the doctor performed operations and dressings. We had neither medicines nor dressing materials. A few bags of medicine, dropped to us from the airplane, were dispersed instantly. None of the wounded throughout the siege of Chertkov received the necessary treatment. Very seldom the necessary medicines were obtained by friends of the patient by any means. The only thing the doctor could do was to disinfect the wound with cognate diluted with water. The housekeepers often had no time to deliver food, and water for drinking was usually obtained by melting snow, which was not always clean. Upon entering this bedlam, the first thing that hit the nose was the nauseating smell of feces. Most of the wounded could not go outside to use the restroom. In addition, the room was always smoky, and from all sides of the room there were pitiful cries and moans. Someone was constantly asking for water, food, smoke, and there was no end to it all. Outside, the sight was no better. The snow around the house was covered with a layer of human excrement, and there was always some unfortunate person trying to fulfill his natural needs in the cold. Not far from the entrance, the Russian prisoners had dug several deep trenches. In the trenches, they laid the corpses of the dead in the infirmary and nearby houses. Every day a new layer of dead bodies appeared in these mass graves. I came here several times. Sometimes near the pit, friends of the deceased would hammer in a wooden cross, hastily made of whatever boards they could find. On the cross, most often in pencil, was written the name of the deceased in the trench, the unit where he served, and his rank. Often on such a homemade monument could be read the phrase, which in those conditions seemed, to put it mildly, strange caduto per patria. Sometimes these shallowly embedded crosses fell into the pit and lay there mixed with the bodies. Only a blanket of snow served as a shroud for the dead. Of the officers of the 62nd Battalion, only Lugaritzi remained in the infirmary. During the bayonet attack, he received bullet wounds in both arms and in the chest. Lugaritzi himself wished to stay in this hell in the hope that sooner or later doctors and medicines would appear and then he would be helped. He was faithfully cared for by his faithful orderly Bozza, a young peasant with a constantly worried expression on his face. In the same bayonet attack, Bozza received a bullet wound in the shoulder. Lugaritzi lay silently in the dirt and stench surrounding him on a mattress. I tried to ease his suffering by bringing him some brandy, which he had asked for, and also by faithfully recounting all the news I knew. Lugaritzi smiled gratefully, but looked lonely and very unhappy. With the arrival of Antonini, Bellini, Brida, and Pilu known, life in our little house had certainly taken on some new features, but on the whole had not changed. About 3 in the afternoon it was getting dark. We ate, read prayers, and fell asleep. People who had been through a lot slept restlessly, and groans and frightened cries were often heard in the darkness. We woke up when it was dawning, that is about 7 o'clock in the morning. We spent most of the day without getting up from our bunks. We all had unhappy thoughts. Would the Alpine Division come? Would the long-awaited German tanks get here? Or is the only thing we have to look forward to is death? Naturally, we often talked about the approach of fresh units, whose arrival could hardly be counted on anymore. Each of us tried hard not to show our despair openly. We often joked, told each other funny stories that had happened to us or our friends in the distant peaceful life. Once Bellini entertained us for an entire evening, retelling the exploits of Lieutenant M and his friends who had not long ago left for Italy. We laughed heartily. It may seem strange, but we discussed more than once the theoretical problems of reorganizing our army. We were unanimous in the opinion that the Italian army, if it is reorganized as suggested to us by the experience gained at the front and bring it in line with certain criteria, may well be a good army and not inferior to any other. The main thing is not to repeat the serious mistakes we made. We even made a list of the necessary criteria and discussed each one in turn. The result was a complete and rather organic picture. But in the present book I will not go into the details of our theoretical explorations. We were still very weak physically. Our unchanged diet of galettes and canned meat was not conducive to a rapid return of strength and health. For this reason, in order to save the soldiers from unnecessary work, I did not make them remove the 2 corpses discovered one morning just outside our door. They were the bodies of a German soldier and a Russian who had served in the German army. The German's eyes and mouth were wide open, horror frozen on his face. One of them had his clothes unbuttoned and his lower abdomen shamelessly exposed. I could not stand it and covered his naked body, carefully fastening all the buttons of his overcoat. I think the soldiers were killed by partisans. All I did was to order that the door should always be locked at night, and that those who had to go out at night for natural necessities should be especially careful. There couldn't help but be partisans here. It was said that not far from the front line they slaughtered a German officer, and at the same time the whole family of Russians in whose house he lived. Only the father of the family survived, who managed to escape to the Germans. He told what had happened. This was further proof that the Russians were no less cruel than the Germans. I left the house more often than other officers. I always wanted to find out the latest news or to visit acquaintances. During one of my walks, I noticed the body of an Italian soldier whose hands were covered with fine knitted gloves. After hesitating, I took the gloves off the corpse. Mine were completely worn out, but I didn't use them for long. They were stolen from me almost immediately. One day I got 2 handkerchiefs. They were given to me by Califano, the former officer in charge of the 2nd Battery's food service, now the chief cook of our house. He had gotten a whole pack somewhere. Now I didn't have to tear off pieces of lining to wipe my nose. St. Silvestro's Day came the last day of my first year in the war. Waking up after a 12-hour sleep, we argued languidly. Was it the last day of the old year or the first day of the new? We had to go to headquarters and make sure that today was indeed December 31. On the way home, I heard that Colonel Casassa, commander of the 80th Infantry Regiment, required 2 officers for a special assignment. Velorzi and I decided to volunteer. It turned out that we were to patrol the streets and apprehend soldiers who were walking with stolen food from the warehouses. Considering the number of starving people, we were hardly capable of taking any serious steps in this direction. Nevertheless, we set out to wander the streets, which we did faithfully until breakfast. After taking refreshment, we resumed our interrupted occupation. We often met people carrying boxes of galettes, sacks of flour, macaroni. After the Germans seized everything they liked and created their own warehouses, they gave us back the remains of the old Italian warehouses. Now, often with the connivance of the sentries, the most enterprising and the most hungry could provide themselves with food without much difficulty. We explained to everyone that they would be severely punished and offered to return the supplies back to the warehouse. Once, when we were patrolling the street, a German truck loaded with loaves of bread drove by. On a bend, one of them fell out and was immediately picked up by a soldier who happened to be nearby. We stopped him at once, because he had a sack with flour dangling on his shoulder. We offered the lucky man to give the bread to another soldier who was slowly dragging along the road. Miserable, dressed in rags, limping, the soldier flatly refused. Then we ordered him to follow us, intending to bring him to headquarters and accuse him of stealing flour. He complied. Hearing that it was about bread, the second soldier, a skinny southerner, jumped after us on the road, crying out pitifully, "Comrade, a piece of bread?" Velorzi and I shook our heads at the same time, as if wishing to say, "How they are all alike, these southerners. Even on the Russian front, the eternal confrontation between Italians, southerners and northerners has not subsided. We northerners have always had a low opinion of our fellow southerners, although, to be honest, we hardly had any reason for it. At the time, we did not yet realize the extent of our delusion. It was only a few years later at home that I saw from statistics that in the post-war period, it was thanks to the votes of Southerners that Italy did not fall into the clutches of the communists. It turned out that the electorate in the south of Italy was more responsible for their civic duty than the self-respecting population in the centre and north of the country. In the end, we reached a compromise. The loaf was split in half between the 2 soldiers. We saved another soldier from being massacred. A German sentry almost shot him for stealing some potatoes. That day, on our own initiative, we went door to door to find out what conditions the soldiers were living in. Fortunately, almost all of them had food supplies, though they consisted mainly of galettes, but it was still better than nothing. Otherwise, the unfortunates would not have survived. In every house there were wounded and frostbitten, and all of them, without exception, complained about the unfair system of food distribution. Some had not yet managed to find shelter for themselves. Because of the shortage of houses in the sector of the city assigned to us, people were living in dilapidated, unheated, air-blown rooms. As a matter of fact, we learned nothing new. Not long ago, a large group of soldiers had taken up residence in a dilapidated hut near the headquarters. Through the huge holes in the walls, I'd been watching them sit around a smoky, stinking fire for That day, we saw one remarkably touching scene. In a distant hut lay a sick, very young junior lieutenant selflessly cared for by the guys from his platoon. They brought him to town on a sledge and assured us that they would not abandon the commander, no matter what happened. So in the besieged city, good and evil, suffering and nobility were bizarrely mixed. But only suffering clearly exceeded. We tried to console the suffering, but what could empty words do? At the end of the day, we went with a report to Colonel Kasasa and tried to outline to him the situation in the city. The colonel, who by this time had several patches for wounds on his sleeve and was wounded again, listened to us very attentively. He then informed us that 4,000 men were receiving food rations every day. I took the liberty of explaining that there were at least 8,000 Italians in the city now, which meant that about half of them were not receiving food rations because of the improper distribution system. The colonel shook his head fiercely. He did not seem to doubt for a moment that the number of our compatriots in Chertkovo was really no more than 4,000. A few days later, the exact figures became known. It turned out that there were 7,600 people in Chertkovo. So my figure was close to the truth. That evening, both Valorzi and I had a heavy heart. We walked down the street and had a leisurely conversation. We talked a little about our studies together, then he remembered his fiancée. We were surrounded on all sides by ramshackle wooden shacks, in which hundreds, thousands of Italians sat and lay, sadly watching their limbs turn black, devoured by gangrene, and their wounds rot. And every day these men died. All around, enemy shells exploded incessantly, also taking many human lives. In the evening we met a ragged German on the road who was carrying pies in his hands. On St. Silvestro's Day the Germans were given a special ration. He addressed us in his own language. Valorzi, who spoke German quite well, replied, after which the German laughed and began to shower us with profanity. When we answered, we did not choose our words either. What else could we do? We couldn't shoot him. But Valorzi was still worried for a long time, remembering this unpleasant episode. We also celebrated New Year's Eve. Conti suggested that on this occasion we go to bed later, which we did, postponing the bedtime until 8 o'clock in the evening. Afterwards we had a long time to laugh at ourselves, gathered around the holiday table under the yellowish light of the burning cable. We ate minestrone flavoured with canned meat, said a prayer, and then just talked, carefully avoiding unpleasant topics. But thoughts of those we love still couldn't drive away. Where are they now? What are they doing? Maybe they can't find a place to be because they're worried about us, or celebrating New Year's Eve. Eventually, the people quieted down and the house became quiet. Only from somewhere far away came the loud staccato of machine gun fire. I fell asleep, though I was very tired of lice, which lately had taken a liking to my company. But should I be surprised? We had not changed our underwear for a month and never undressed. Even at night we slept clothed, taking off only our boots. The morning of January 1, 1943 came. We woke up and each of us slowly went about our business, trying not to disturb the others. As usual, I whispered my morning prayers to the Madonna of my people, the Madonna of the forests. Only that morning my soul was especially heavy, even though I felt her protection, the result of my mother's tireless prayers. The feeling was very real, as clear as sight and hearing, and I was not alone. All of us, to one degree or another, felt the effect of the fervent prayers of our loved ones. Even Mario Bellini, a man less susceptible to suggestion than the others and not at all ecclesiastical in mind, told me with bewilderment about the strange visions that visited him on the first night of our march to Chertkovo. That morning I decided to throw away all anxious and sad thoughts and plunged into a state of apathy, that is, complete indifference to everything around me. On the first day of the new year, we received a congratulatory message from Garibaldi, General, Commander of the 8th Army. The greeting also contained a wish to cheer up and continue the resistance. Resist. I wonder if the General had the slightest idea of the state we were in. We couldn't help but feel resentful. The General never personally appeared to the troops. He only periodically transmitted his guidelines by radio through the German headquarters. And this at a time when the remnants of 3 corps of the army entrusted to him are surrounded in Chertkovo. Couldn't he have flown here at least for a few hours? If he had done so, he would have seen with his own eyes the countless number of wounded and frostbitten, who were constantly dying of gangrene. Maybe then he would not have talked about resistance, but would have ensured the delivery of medicines and surgical instruments. That was our common viewpoint. At that time we did not yet know that the General was preoccupied with other problems. Very soon his son would be trapped with the Alpine Division. Who knows what kind of suffering the father will have to endure? I heard that in the first week of the siege, heavy German planes landed in Chertkovo 3 or 4 times. Italian planes came twice. On one of them arrived General Enrico Pezzi, commander of the Italian air forces in Russia, and Bocchetti, a colonel of the medical service in charge of the hospitals in Kharkov. They wanted to get a first-hand look at the situation. On the way back, their plane disappeared. Most likely it was shot down, but we did not know about it and resented it, indignantly recalling the promises of the medical colonel, who was shocked by what he had seen and assured us that he would ensure the delivery of medical supplies. One of the soldiers recounted a horrible scene he happened to witness. An Italian twin-engine airplane was loaded with wounded men, but it turned out that the plane could not take off because of too much cargo, so some of the wounded were unloaded back onto the snow. Imagine the depth of despair of the people who already thought they were safe. They were forcibly returned to Bedlam, where they could only wait for death. The soldier who told me this was shocked by the condition of one elderly major who had almost lost his mind. He himself was dressed in rags, and his legs were wrapped in filthy scraps of blankets fastened with pieces of wire. The unhappy old man collapsed on the snow and began rolling around in it, crying and waving his arms. After the new year came heavy airplanes did not come anymore, because the Russians came close to the airfield and shot heavy guns at the runway. Now in Chertkovo landed only Storky, small German reconnaissance planes, which needed only a few dozen meters for takeoff and landing. Germans ROP supplies, on parachutes, Italians he just a little, in bags, similar to backpacks and without any parachutes, due to the complete absence of the latter. As I have already said, in order to make sure that we received our cargo, the Italian pilots, risking their lives, flew very low, always escorted by the fierce fire of the Russians. When our sad odyssey was over, I had a chance to visit the airfield of Voroshilovgrad, which was then a base for Italian airplanes. I learned that 9 out of 12 B-20 Fiats at the base had been shot down during flights over Chertkovo. This is significant for two events: the attempt to unite all Italians in Century and the creation of a large hospital. For a long time there had been talks about the need to form a Century. It seemed that only then it would be possible to bring at least some order to the chaos in which we lived. From January 2, it was established that food would be distributed by Centuria. Thus, whoever did not enter any of the combat units would remain hungry. It became immediately clear that our command was making a grave mistake by combining people from the most diverse units into one Centuria. It should have been from the very beginning to distribute living quarters between specific regiments, so that the surviving soldiers from previously active units were placed side by side. But now our senior officers were hesitant to take such a step. There was a shortage of suitable accommodation. There was a danger that if a huge resettlement began, there would simply not be enough houses for everyone. Besides, in every house there were wounded and frostbitten people who received at least some care. Therefore, it was decided to make do with half measures and create mixed Century. However, the chaos did not diminish. Those who had food supplies did not rush to the Century, rightly fearing immediate dispatch to the front line. In the end, of the 8,000 Italians were formed only 3 or 4 Century. Conti and Balestra decided to enlist in the Centuria, where Vallozzi was the company commander. A few days later they were allocated a small house where they moved. Meanwhile, Giudici felt the first signs of frostbite and stayed with us as a reserve officer. Bellini, Antonini and I volunteered to join another Centuria, being formed under the command of Captain Pontoriero of the 62nd Battalion. It included Carletti and many more soldiers from the 30th Brigade. There was no space where Pontoriero was stationed, so we didn't move anywhere. Some confusion began because Pontoriero considered us his men, and at the same time we received food together with Vallozzi, Conti, Balestra and other men from Century Giudici as his reserve officers. The attempt to organize the people in the Century only caused increasing chaos. Complete anarchy reigned all around. None of us had any desire to try to restore order either, so we decided to do nothing, stay where we were and stall for time, waiting for the revival of the 30th Brigade. Zanotti was in the same position as we were. One evening he and I and Mario Bellini went to see W., who was now the most senior officer of the 30th Brigade. We were going to demand that he, as commander, take steps to create a new fighting unit out of the remnants of the brigade. At that time, W. was not in charge of brigade affairs. He was in charge of the food distribution center. He was not very ceremonious with us and made it clear that we should mind our own business. I, like most junior officers, did not like this man. Dislike for him all the more intensified after the night of the general escape from Arbuzov. He sat with us in the ravine until late in the evening, and in the morning he disappeared without warning anyone. So I told him everything I had to say. He threw me out, and everything stayed the same. Corporal Navoni, former subordinate of my friend Sortzi, had also moved out of our house to be closer to Conti's company. Now I had no one to talk to about my dear dead friend, but he sometimes came to visit and constantly reminded me not to forget about him when the 30th Brigade would be created again. Trying to do at least something to improve the care of the wounded, General X decided to organize a large hospital. In a low-lying area in the northeastern part of the city stood an imposing and quite modern building. Before the war it must have housed a school, and, considering its considerable size, some public facilities. Some of the rooms in this largest building in the city were occupied by the Germans. They made them available to us for the hospital. We had to expend a great deal of effort to clear the rooms of debris. Most of the window panes were broken. Since the windows were double-framed, we found the surviving inner frames and put them in the windows. The premises immediately became habitable. The work was supervised by Temistocles Ruoko, a captain in the medical service, clearly an enthusiastic worker. I watched him while in Chertkovo, and I believe that this young southerner showed himself to be at his best. On January 2, several rooms were prepared to receive the wounded, and people started coming to the hospital. Some waddled on their own, others were carefully supported by friends. On the first floor were rooms reserved for officers. I advised Candela that he should not miss this opportunity. He obeyed and moved there with Sergeants Breda and Pillone, who were also frostbitten. The patients from the infirmary were also to be moved to the new hospital. For this purpose it was decided to use 3 or 4 trucks that were at the disposal of our headquarters in Chertkovo. For an hour or two I watched them being loaded at the door of the infirmary. It was a terrible sight. Twice there were orders to suspend transportation because there was no more room in the hospital. The others had to wait until the room was ready. In the meantime, the wounded and frostbitten, who were unable to walk the 600 or 700 meters that separated them from the hospital, dragged themselves to the infirmary waiting for trucks. The loading was uneven. One day another order to suspend it came just at the moment when 3 or 4 ragged, groaning men were lying on the snow near the truck. When they heard the order, they did not wait for further explanation, but began shouting to be taken to the truck. The soldiers paid no attention to the shouts. Then the wounded began to crawl forward in the snow, trying to block the way to the truck. They moved on their hands, dragging their immobile lower bodies behind them. This is exactly the way wounded animals with broken backs crawl. None of the unfortunates had completely lost his human form. He had even managed to rise to his feet, and now stood motionless, leaning against a pillar. His arms were hanging limply, and his eyes seemed stopped, expressing nothing. His mouth was alive. His lips moved and spat out incoherent words, requests, insults, prayers. I made sure that this man was loaded into the truck with the others lying in the snow, and only then did I leave. I couldn't help but notice one of the drivers. He turned out to be a remarkably kind and understanding man. Later he complained in confidence, speaking in a soft Venetian accent, that he had broken his back loading and unloading the wounded. The wounded were being transported to the hospital, but the infirmary remained overcrowded. In the evening I went to the hospital to visit Candela. Unfortunately, the officers' rooms, located on the first floor, were very cold, and it was impossible to heat them. In one of them there was a soldier lying almost naked and dirty on the floor. He appeared to be beating in a death agony. When I entered, the officers asked me to take him somewhere. They said that strange soldiers had brought him here and dumped him, paying no heed to his protests. I called the soldiers who were cleaning the room and demanded that they find another place for the dying man. They had to use force and even threatened them with arms. But still, I succeeded in getting the unfortunate man carried to the second floor and placed in a warm room. After making sure that everything was done properly, I went downstairs again. Many of the officers were familiar to me. Here, besides Candela, were Captains Lanciani and Rico, both of the 80th Infantry Regiment. Although Rico's legs were wounded by shrapnel, he waddled slowly around the room and tried to help those who could not stand up at all. Behind his unpresentable appearance was a very kind heart. The man's normally pale but calm face was now blue and distorted with suffering. I could not allow my friends to remain in these cold rooms, and went to Captain Ruoko. From the latter I learned that 100 meters from the main hospital there was a small one-story building which was just now being prepared for officers. I immediately went to see how things were going. Seeing that it was clean and quite warm, I immediately conveyed Candela there, and then we, together with Captain Nanciani's orderly, carefully carried the wounded captain there, having arranged both men in what I thought was the best part of the room. I went again across the snowy courtyard to the hospital. A clumsy and, in my opinion, surprisingly ugly concrete statue of a woman in modern clothes, there are many of them in the Soviet Union, seemed to follow my movements back and forth across the yard with unkind black eyes. Next to her was the pedestal of another statue that had been blown away by the explosion. The only thing left standing were giant cement shoes with thick metal rods sticking out of them. Looking at these ugly creations, I involuntarily thought about the fact that the victory of communism brought to the Soviet people not only the loss of faith in God. It incomprehensibly deprived the Russian people of the sense of beauty that had been with them for centuries. The side of the hospital, as well as the concrete figure, was riddled with bullet and shrapnel marks. But the place was quiet now. The shells were falling in a part of the city far away from us, hitting every living thing. I also helped a strange officer from Battalion M. His legs were blackened with gangrene, so he could not walk. I set him up next to Candela. It was getting late, so I left, promising that I would come again tomorrow. When I came out, another truck had just stopped at the door, bringing in the wounded and frostbitten of all ranks and grades from the centre of the city. Pretty soon all the rooms in this building would be full too. The days succeeded each other. Quite often we received encouraging news of reinforcements coming. Most likely this information was generated in the German headquarters and then disseminated by them. Sometimes we were told that a tank column was on its way, other times that the Alpine Division was entering the city, other times that German infantry divisions were moving toward us. We had already experienced so many disappointments that we did not listen too much to this, if I may say so, news. We were not expecting anything good, and something extraordinary had to happen for hope to rise in our hearts. During the night, we heard a muffled, distant rumbling added to the usual sounds. It could have been the noise of a distant battle. At first, we did not pay much attention to it, but the noise did not subside, and soon we turned to listen, holding our breath. It became clear that the noise was getting closer. It could be heard even in the daytime. 30 or 40 kilometers west of us, there was a battle going on. But what was it? Reinforcements breaking through to our aid, or a besieged garrison like ours, trying to find a way out of the ring? But we began to hope again. In those days, we witnessed several aerial battles between German and Russian airplanes. The soldiers saw a German airplane catch fire, and the pilot jumped out with a parachute. True, the parachute seemed to land in Russian territory. Why didn't the Russians organize a massive air raid and bomb the territory where we were stationed? As far as I could tell, based on my experience of being at the front for 7 months, the Russians had very little aviation. They had to use the few available airplanes on other, more important parts of the front. I wonder which ones. Mystery. We didn't know how much of the occupied territory they managed to liberate. We had information that the Russians were entrenched in Kantemirovka and Milorov. We also knew that Starobelsk was not yet occupied by the Russians, and that the army headquarters was still located there. Our morale was somewhat strengthened by the news that our mail, which was still held at headquarters, had been sent to Kharkov by a German stork. My letters were there too. I informed my parents that I was alive and unharmed and asked them to enroll me in the 3rd year of university. Later I found out that only one of the letters reached its destination, and that was very late. The German stork carried only German mail. Therefore the headquarters accumulated a huge number of letters, but the plane for them never arrived. In those days I met again with Berge, my Vecchi from the 2nd Battery. It was surprisingly pleasant to feel that my former soldiers still respected and loved me. But I nipped in the bud the impulse with the heel of my savvy boot to make a number of other noble decisions to be worthy of respect. The Borgie had a small basin, and I washed my sore and very dirty feet in warm water for the first time in a long time. During our whole stay in Chertkovo, I only once managed to wash my face and hands with soap and in warm water. It was unfair to occupy for personal needs a tiny stove where there were always wokes of food or a large bowl of snow from which drinking water was obtained. And soon I met my resident Reginato. If I could see Torzi again! But there was no hope of that. Reginato, a stocky big man from Veneto, had become my orderly shortly before the retreat began, when his predecessor had gone home on leave. Reginato brought my camera. How many pictures I would now be able to take? But after brief reflection, I decided to refrain. I was not attracted to the idea that someone could ever experience the satisfaction of looking at the endless suffering depicted in my photographs. I took only a few pictures in Chertkovo. Reginato photographed me against the background of the house. A faithful resident stayed with me until the very end of the siege. His legs were covered with sores, but he walked confidently enough. I could not accept the absence of Gimondi and Giuseppini from the city. These men had helped me a great deal on the first night of the retreat and had firmly promised that if I could not walk, they would share my fate, whatever it might be. I had heard nothing of Gimondi, a native of Bergamo, but I was told that Giuseppini, a grey-haired peasant from the Lodi plain, who always wore a shawl around his neck in summer, though it was not in accordance with regulations, had been killed in the Valley of Death during a bayonet attack. Russian machine gun fire for a long time did not let our soldiers raise their heads. They lay huddled in the snow, unable to get past the machine gunner. Losing patience and angry, Giuseppini suddenly jumped up and abruptly rushed forward, clamped in his teeth dagger. The line seemed to cut his body in two. That's how Corporal Giuseppini met his end. I also learned of the death of a young sergeant who had always been a sort of errand boy for our battalion command. Before the retreat began, everyone had said with one voice that he was a remarkably capable, hopeful young man. We liked it that way, though it was an exaggeration. The guy was universally liked, as he willingly took on any task, performing all tasks with a friendly smile. In one of the last days of our stay in the Valley of Death, he was walking along Arbazov and wanted to smoke. Clasping a cigarette in his lips, he realized that he had neither matches nor a lighter, and asked a passing soldier to give him a light. The latter flicked his lighter and went on his way. A few seconds later, there was the whistle of a flying shell and an explosion. The sergeant's head was torn off, which rolled back quite far from the place where the body fell. A soldier, who had not yet had time to put away his lighter, hurried back and bent over the decapitated body in horror. The tragedy had happened before his eyes, but he couldn't believe that he had been talking to this man seconds ago. One day I accompanied Lugarese to the hospital. I was talking to Antonini, and Lugarese was getting ready for dressing. He had not treated his wounds for 6 or 7 days. When they removed the bandages, it turned out that the wound on his right arm completely healed. I pointed out this gratifying fact to Lugarese. I thought he was surprised. He seemed to have forgotten that he had a bullet wound on his right arm, but the wounds on his left arm and chest were very inflamed and festering. I supported Lugarese while he sat on a chair, while the doctor treated his wounds with brandy diluted with water and applied fresh bandages. At one point I asked Antonini to take my place and jumped out into the street. Looking at Lugarese's red, swollen, festering flesh, at his greenish-yellow face, I felt an attack of nausea. Fortunately, it didn't last long. When the dressing was over, Lugarese grabbed my arm and whispered frantically that he would never go to the hell misleadingly called the infirmary. The first thing I did was to take him into our house and lay him on my metal bed. Bozza, Lugarese's faithful orderly, did not move a step away from the wounded man. Lugarese lay reclined on the back of the bed. He looked at us and tried to speak calmly, though he did not succeed too well. We stood silently around him and could do nothing to help. Looking at his lifeless hands, yellowed face, and feverishly glistening eyes, we thought the end of the unfortunate man was near. After a few hours he cheered up a little, and I went to the hospital. That day the second one-story building, which was intended only for officers, was to be finished preparing to receive the wounded. The main building and the first small building was already full. In some rooms the situation was no better than in the old infirmary. Here, placed already 1,700 people, and in the city were still without help many thousands of wounded and frostbitten Italians. Several times in the main building flew shells and exploded in the thick of curled up on the straw bodies. The corpses were removed, windows and walls were hastily patched up, and then other wounded men took their place. There were many people waiting to be sent to the hospital as a great... I decided that the Lugarese should be placed in the newly prepared building. Conti got a sled. We put the wounded man on it and went outside. 2 soldiers were driving the sled, who had a bullet wound in his shoulder, and some other soldiers followed, carrying Lugarese's few belongings and my dismantled bed. When we reached the place, it turned out that the officers' quarters were already full. but I did manage to get my wonderful little bed between the other two. Bozza had found a corner in the closet where I had tried in vain to cram the bed. Although it was small, it didn't fit in the closet. Lugarazzi said that several officers were dying in the room where they had put him. He was superstitiously afraid that, since he was also an officer, the room boded bad luck for him. At dawn on January 4, the Russians launched a furious attack. This was the second large-scale enemy attack on the fortified point Chertkovo. In spite of everything, the town held out so far. This time, the Russians concentrated 220 large forces and put into battle tanks in the number of 10-12 units. Apparently, they were determined to take the city and confident of success. A Russian major, who was captured by the Germans, reported that when he and his men crossed the Don, they did not anticipate any resistance and planned to quickly reach Donetsk. It was said that the major was immediately shot after interrogation. However, this was a common practice for the Germans. This time the Russians did not pass either. Their tanks were held up by heavy fire from German anti-tank guns, and almost all of them were hit. Only one or two managed to get away. The small plain that spread out in front of the German line of fortifications was now covered with the bodies of Russian soldiers. It was another valley of death, but now already Chertkovo. During this action, the black shirts once again showed themselves perfectly. One of them, Dino Betty, had a trophy Russian anti-tank gun with which he shot up a Russian tank. Battalion M soldiers then ran up to the tank and threw several grenades inside through the embrasure. As a result of the operation, the Russians still gained some advantages. They came close to the German. The shots, which were heard all day, became more rare in the evening, and by nightfall they subsided. On the morning of January 5, I was in the house of Captain Ponturiero with Antonini. There was an order Centuria urgently go to the warehouses and put out the fire. Our warehouses are on fire. The prospect of starvation loomed before us again. We immediately set out to gather men. Soon our Centuria was on its way to the warehouses. The morning was frosty and very windy. As we walked along, we thought wistfully that this same wind, which penetrated our clothes and tormented our flesh, was also fanning the fire that was destroying our food. We walked along the railroad, crossed the town, and approached the first dilapidated warehouse buildings. There we saw shapeless piles of pasta mixed with rubble, planks, debris, and splinters. All this was piled up under roofs, ready to collapse at any moment. Then we passed the Italian sentries and entered the inner courtyard. Here the work was in full swing. Praise God, the flames did not threaten the stock of galettes and canned goods. It only destroyed a long stack of cloth and packing material. The neat rolls appeared to be intact, but had changed their structure into dirty white ashes. Thousands of wool blankets and sleeping bags were burned. When we arrived, the flames had already engulfed stacks of prefabricated wooden houses. I realized that we had some serious work to do to keep the fire from spreading. Putting aside unnecessary doubts, I set to work. Not far from us, German soldiers were hustling at the machine gun. A few were scrounging around the corners, looking for ammunition. Not so long ago, we saw them wandering around the city. It turns out that they are also short of ammunition. The German line of defense ran through our warehouses here. Enemy bullets whistled over our heads, and the Germans immediately returned fire. We hurried to get away from the shot space, just in case. The fire did not think to retreat. When cartridges scattered on the snow hit it, there were cheerful pops. It was hard to get the men to work. The minutes in the cold flowed slowly, dragging. I saw the lethargy and apathy of our soldiers, the impassive imperturbability of the Germans who watched our work, and a doubt began to creep into my soul. Why all this? Could it be that my understanding of reality, which guided my every decision and action, was only a phantom castle, which at the slightest breeze would melt into thin air without a trace? Is it true that somewhere there is a distant and warm country, Italy? No, it's better not to think about it. It's not long to go crazy. Nevertheless, somewhere in the most secret corner of my soul, I never stopped hoping that someday I would see my native Italy. And how did the others feel? Despite the mental confusion I was experiencing, outwardly I remained confident and energetic and worked as hard as anyone else. We got the fire out and went back to our house. It was very cold there. January 6, Epiphany. Our families in Italy are very anxious about us. A few days earlier, Copti had been lucky enough to get a sleeping bag. He undressed completely and dove in, anticipating the pleasure of a restful sleep without the constant company of lice. He fell asleep quickly, but after a while he burst into tears in his sleep. He moaned again and again, repeating, "No, Mommy, no." I was lying closest to him, on a neighbouring bench, so I immediately started to wake him up. But even when he finally woke up, Copty was still shivering and sobbing for a long time. Memories of loved ones and loved ones did not help or support us in our time of need. They haunted and Mario Bellini also moaned quietly in his sleep. I was told that I often cry out in my sleep, sometimes emitting pitiful moans. Antonini slept quietly, but continually stirred restlessly. He never took off even his boots for the night, believing that in this way he would be able to get up more quickly if the Russians entered the city. He often said that he prayed to God for only one thing, not to be captured alive. Everything else, he said, didn't matter. The soldiers were in the same position as we were. None of them suddenly fell ill. We did everything we could for him, but unfortunately there was almost nothing we could do to help. He had to cope with the illness on his own. We had only a few spoons, which we took turns using. At first we had none at all, then someone got a couple of them, and then we carved some more out of wood. Still, there weren't enough for everyone. Those who finished their meal immediately passed the spoons to the next. There was always a lot of joking about it. In the evening, when everyone was supposed to celebrate Epiphany, Valorzi received sets of white German uniforms for himself and his men. Dressed, he left with the soldiers to the front line. Conti, armed with a Russian automatic rifle, also left with his platoon. I think Bellestra left with them. In the evening, I visited Logorizzi and Candela in the hospital. On my way back, I was met by a soldier who had been sent for by Captain Pontoriero. I reported immediately. He said he had orders to send a platoon to the front lines and wanted me to lead it. It was me, not Bellini, Carletti or Antonini, as I was in better shape than they were. Pontoriero had intended to send Zanotti with the platoon, but was unable to locate him. While Pontoriero was briefing me, Zanotti showed up. The selfish part of me rejoiced. Meanwhile, at Captain Pontoriero's house, the soldiers were preparing to carry out their orders. They put on overcoats, brown knitted helmets, and generally tried to insulate themselves as much as possible. How familiar it all was to me. It reminded me of the days when we were still proud. Zanotti started packing too. He was clearly nervous, his usual cheerfulness, so typical of the Milanese, had disappeared. Somehow it seemed that he was overcome with misgivings. I'd never seen him like this before. I stooped so low that I even reproached him for being too nervous. I did not know that in his sole youth and cheerfulness were actively protesting against the prospect of near death. I realized this a little later and felt a spiritual closeness with him. We had much in common. Like him, I was a student at the University of Milan. So sometime I tried to gather all my courage in a fist and force myself to take his place. But I couldn't. Apparently, noble deeds had become inaccessible to me. Zanotti walked away. Young, tall, and very attractive, despite his worn and dirty clothes, the platoon followed him. The night shadows gradually lengthened, streaking the gloomy road. I sluggishly walked back to the house, mentally coaxing myself. I can't now, but a little later when it's not so scary. I'll definitely become brave and noble again like I once was, but not now. Later, and then apathy came over me again. We spent the Epiphany evening in a small circle. Antonibi Gudici, Bellini and I. We sat in an empty house. Polito Valorzi's orderly, whom he had not brought with him, was preparing minestrone. We sat on the only vacant bench and a few rolled-up bunks. An oil-soaked wick burned dimly in an empty sardine can. We ate, occasionally exchanging meaningless words. It was dark all around. Sometimes a rocket would fly over the German positions and light up the night city for a few seconds. This is how the Epiphany passed. On the morning of January 7, the Germans began their attack. They aimed to push back the Russians to the positions they had previously occupied. The fight lasted all morning. As a result, the Russians retreated and consolidated at a distance of several kilometers from the German positions. Nevertheless, the far approaches to the city were still in their hands. It was said that in those days the killing frost fought both opposing sides and caused each a very impressive damage. Even the troops who had come from Siberia suffered. The Germans brought tanks into the battle. 2 of them were hit, the rest returned in deplorable condition. This was the third and last of the big battles in the Chertkovo area. Meanwhile, shells continued to explode periodically in the city. Shooting was heard everywhere. That day a soldier came from the Italian positions and told me that during the night an artillery lieutenant was killed. I immediately thought of Zanotti, and then Polito, who was visiting Valorzi, came back and confirmed. Zanotti was killed. Alarmed in the middle of the night, he and his men went to the trench. At that time, a shell fell right under his feet. Zanotti was killed on the spot. His face was torn to shreds by small pieces of shrapnel. Corporal Oronese, who was walking behind Zanotti, and another soldier were wounded. I decided to visit our position and take a photograph of Zanotti's remains. I was going to give the photograph to his mother, who lived in Milan. It turned out that Zanotti had already been buried, and, as Valorzi said, his face was not in such a state that it was worth photographing, let alone showing it to his mother. So I went to see the place where he was buried. It turned out that no grave, as such, had been dug. He and another soldier had been put under a large layer of earth that had been torn out by the explosion and covered with straw. When I approached, the grave was already covered with snow, and it blended in with the surrounding landscape. Suddenly 2 Fiat Bar 20s appeared in the sky. Flying over our heads, they dropped ammunition boxes. After making a circle, they returned and dropped the rest of their cargo. Our pilots risked their lives to help. We did not know then that many of them did not return to base from these sorties. Many crates crashed and the snow was covered with ammunition. The Germans, who were watching what was going on, quickly headed for the fallen crates. They probably expected to find some food. Valorzi sent soldiers to gather the scattered cargo into blankets and bring them back to their positions. The men felt overwhelmed. It took a lot of effort to get them to move. Each one had to be lifted off the mattress and kicked out into the cold. On my way back to the city, I passed a huge German tank abandoned on a steep embankment. Outwardly, it looked undamaged. Apparently, it was one of those that had been hit in the last hours of the battle. As the number of tanks dwindled, our already very slim chances of escape diminished. Therefore, I quite understood and did not blame the men who had lost all hope. In the following days, I spent a lot of time in the headquarters. Here things had changed considerably. Obviously, the new formidable name, Commando Truppi in Linea, had had an impact. Outside, the walls were reinforced with long and thin tree trunks. This gave some protection from shrapnel. Inside, in the former room of a late lieutenant colonel, our commander, the Russian prisoners were now engaged in excavation work, building an underground room. The entrance was made from the side of the square where the infirmary and Coletti's house had been. Now there were sentries on duty there all the time. I spent a lot of time with the adjutant, who seemed to me a rather colourful person. He told me once, and quite indifferently, that he himself had shot 2 soldiers who had been caught stealing food from the storehouse. I don't know whether he was telling the truth or not. In general, the people there were very peculiar. The clerk, in particular, was a rather famous journalist. General Garibaldi, commander of Armia, gave permission to General X to award medals to those who had distinguished themselves in the battles in Chertkovo. In the headquarters developed a flurry of activity, as a result of which medals were to find the most deserving of the 5,000 men who had participated in the battles from the first days of the siege of Chertkovo. General X awarded very few. I was just in the headquarters when the adjutant came to the courier with a list of awarding the soldiers of the only Italian anti-aircraft battery located in the city. This battery had its own history. Its guns were mounted at the intersections of the roads leading into the city. When our column arrived, some of the guns were behind the line of fortifications. The captain commanding the battery made a truly heroic effort, but managed to bring their German tanks, which towed the guns to the city. The commander himself was killed during this operation. Now the battery is commanded by a lieutenant, his former deputy. If only we had guns in Chertkovo. How often my artilleryman's heart sweetly sank when I thought of them. What a magical way our lives could have been changed. Sometimes German artillerymen would set up their guns at city intersections or at the edge of a square and open fire. They fired mostly at close range, setting their sights almost to zero. Their shells exploded after flying no more than a kilometre between the huts on the outskirts of the city. It was said that the enemy was hiding there. Sometimes I would stop and watch the gun shudder violently after a shot. How well I understood that steel dragon. I often froze on high ground and looked around. Now that I had gained a good deal of experience, I could survey the terrain with an expert's eye. I figured out where the guns should be installed, where it would be most convenient to locate an observation post, where it would be safest to lay a telephone line. Little by little I got bored with this. My eyes began to glide mindlessly over the wretched buildings covered with snow. I realized that I was highly indifferent to where and what was located, and went on my way. I went very often to the hospital, where my friends were always anxiously awaiting the little news I managed to learn. Candela always welcomed me with open arms. Captain Lanciani was more reserved, and I found him more and more often absorbed in his Bible. A wound in his shoulder had kept him awake for days, so he looked weary and irritable. I was also warmly greeted by a black-shirted officer whom my friends and I had once picked up and taken to the hospital. There I met other officers, for example, Junior Lieutenants Scotti and Triossi. Except for Captain Lanciani, who got a broken iron bed somewhere, the others slept on the floor in sleeping bags or on mattresses. During the day, those who could get up rolled up their bunks and sat on them. The floor was always kept clean. At times our conversation was interrupted by the close explosion of a fallen shell. Conversation would immediately stop, and people would tensely wait to see where the next one would fall. We are all in the hands of God. But who else but the Almighty God will take care of these unfortunate, maimed people? Sometimes the orderly of Captain Lanciani, who gradually turned into our common, indispensable assistant, while minding his own business, sang. Besides him, no one sang in Chertkovo. Therefore, when his low, pleasantly husky voice sounded, we were silent. He sang softly about love, about a distant homeland, about hope that never dies. And sometimes he would sing dashing, cheerful verses. We listened to the words which had seemed empty and worthless to us before, and were amazed to find in them a new, deep meaning. We remembered those days when we were not yet haunted by misfortune. Then, in spite of the war, my friends and I sang often and with pleasure. Our voices could be heard far around us. It eased our longing for home, peaceful life, the smiles of our loved ones, that is, all that we were deprived of. Even the faceless grey figures moving outside the window seemed a mere contrast to the bright, colourful world of our songs. When the old minstrel's voice fell silent, we sank back into the murky abyss of apathy. One day, January 7 or 8, I decided to bring my wounded friends more news. It was only the Germans who could get information. Not long ago they had spread the amazing news that the Russians who had crossed the Don were themselves trapped. Bulgaria is in the hands of the Germans. There is no information about Moscow and Leningrad. At sunset I went to one of the German headquarters located close to our zone. I was taken to an underground bunker where the command was located. The radio was working there. An Italian student from Milan named Conti was the interpreter in this headquarters. He provided me with the latest news, translated the latest newsletter. Unfortunately, it contained nothing new. The bulletins reported only German counterattacks on the city. We could only listen tensely to the sounds of distant fighting, which came to us mainly at night, and wonder what lay ahead. Conti came outside with me. It was already dark. A German sentry was pacing in front of the headquarters. When he saw us, he asked for the password. When he got the answer, he frowned and demanded we repeat it. He probably didn't like Conti's Italian accent. Eventually, however, he let us in. To make sure I got safely to my abode, Conti insisted on escorting me through the German positions and then through the Italian ones all the way to headquarters. After all, student brotherhood is worth a lot, BO. We walked for a long time through the deserted streets. We were surrounded only by dilapidated houses and dark. A few days later, I went to see Conti again. As before, he had no news about the progress of military operations. Nevertheless, he told me something that surprised me. The king had bestowed the highest award for military valor on General X. It was the decision of the Royal House of Savoy. General Garibaldi radioed it to Chertkovo. The news was not made public. While at headquarters, I glimpsed at the German colonel commanding the garrison in Chertkovo. He turned out to be a middle-aged man, short, thin, with sharp features. He treated his subordinates with true Aryan arrogance. Soon he left the city on one of the stalks, having received the appointment to command the army. He did not return to Chertkovo. A few days later his place was taken by another colonel. Time was running out. Enemy shells were now exploding in all the neighbourhoods of Chertkovo. The air was filled with the whistle of artillery shells of all calibers, the rumble of explosions, the crackle of machine gun bursts. Each flying shell had its own unique sound. We gradually learned to distinguish them. Over time, we became so accustomed to the explosions that we began to consider them an integral part of the environment. And when at night a 50mm mine exploded very close to our house, no more than a meter away from the window where I was sleeping, I just rolled over to the other side without waking up. One evening, as I was on my way to headquarters, several shells fell in the square between headquarters and Carletti's house. One exploded near two soldiers who were standing near a horse in a sleigh. The frightened animal reared up, and the soldiers disappeared in the smoke. Later it turned out that both survived but were wounded. Carletti said that another shell exploded under the door of his house, making several large holes in it and causing the whole house to shake. One of the two Germans walking down the street at that moment was killed on the spot. The other was wounded. Dark winter evenings always brought with them fear. In the depths of our souls, each of us kept his own account, recording in his asset the bitter experience acquired every day. Who knows with what score it would end? Between the headquarters and Carletti's house stood a ramshackle shack. Some of our compatriots who could not find a decent place to live were still huddled here. Outside, on the blackened snow, horses lay in the blackened snow. They were illuminated by the flames of the fire that the unfortunate people were constantly burning. The horses were skinny and gaunt, their hides covered with a crust of ice. As I looked more closely, I noticed that one of them was still alive. The poor animal was dying, but the life was stubbornly unwilling to leave its tormented body. The horse was lying in the cold in agony, breathing heavily and staring straight ahead with unseeing eyes, where tears had frozen into pieces of ice. I came closer. The poor thing sensed my presence, became anxious, and made an attempt to turn her head in my direction. I had to put an end to her torment. Ammo was a pity, so I kicked her hard on the head several times, hoping that my heavy, shoe-shod boot would finish her off. It didn't, and now the poor animal, in sudden pain, was trying to move away from me, unable to stand it. I drew my gun, and in a few seconds it was all over. The snow around was mottled with craters. As before, there were corpses lying on the snow. Here and there one could see dirty, ragged people waddling or even crawling toward the infirmary, and near it there was a black pit filled with corpses which had not been filled in yet. War! I thought of those who had once organized crowded marches in the cities demanding war. Before my eyes slowly passed pictures of rich mansions and luxurious villas whose inhabitants never denied themselves anything. In my mind's eye, I saw rich people living their lives and enjoying themselves in luxurious sea resorts. And here, torn and rotting human flesh. Punishment for past follies? Is God punishing us for our transgressions? One morning the Russians began a massive bombardment with all kinds of guns. It went on for 9 hours without a break. The city was engulfed in an avalanche of fire. Not a single intact building was left standing. Shortly after Christmas, General X held another meeting with senior officers. It was decided to divide the Italian part of the city into zones and assign each of them to a separate military unit. The 30th Artillery Brigade got the ruins on the northern outskirts of the city. On the day of the shelling, Bellini, Antonini, and I went to look at our future apartment, which was already to be vacated by a group of black shirts who had occupied it before us. Bellini was pacing in front. As we approached the door, he stopped suddenly, looked around, listened, then waved his hands, gesturing for us to enter quickly and drop to the floor. I had long ago noticed that Bellini had the ability to hear Katyusha before anyone else. And sure enough, before we knew it, all hell broke loose. 16 shells exploded around us, one after another. We pressed ourselves to the floor, covering our heads with our hands. The house shook, threatening to collapse. I lay back and whispered a silent prayer. Soon we staggered to our feet and stood up. We were all safe. Providence, by giving Bellini a unique hearing, had again saved us from imminent death. Had we left the house, we would certainly have found ourselves near the neighbouring wooden shack, which had been split in two by the shell. And the road where we had just passed was pocked with shell splinters, fragments of wood and iron that had pierced it with force. But the most amazing thing was that in the midst of the ruins, shrouded in smoke that had not yet settled, strewn with debris, stood Lieutenant Colonel Rossi, commander of the 8th Artillery Brigade, alive and unharmed. Before our eyes he shook himself off, adjusted his holster and, without a word, walked away. There were several other men in the house we had time to enter. They were not hurt. As the shells began to fall too close, the three of us, together with my orderly Reginato, left the house and moved to Conti and Balestra. Their house stood a little aside, 80 meters from the avenue. Gidici and his men also moved, but I don't know where. The shelling was truly terrible. From all sides could be heard the shrill whistle of shells and the rumble of explosions. Pillars of snow and earth, fragments of destroyed buildings, and parts of human bodies were flying into the air. Shrapnel screeched against the walls. The Germans' guns, camouflaged not far from us, were returning fire, their shells flying off, emitting a dull, howling sound that could not be confused with anything else. Everywhere, as far as the eye could see, there were ruins of houses and craters from explosions. The main square of the city, where the tanks stood, was covered in a cloud of smoke. When shells fell very close, we looked at each other in silence and smiled. God's will for everything. In the morning we had to return to our house, because Reginato, whom I had sent there to bring some food, came back with the message that we had looters in our house. Mario Bellini caught one and nearly shot him. Seeing my friend's sincere indignation at the dishonesty of others, I could barely keep from laughing. By God, I should be used to it by now. Having calmed down a little, Bellini carefully wrote down the name of the marauder, intending to report him to headquarters. In our house, all the windows were blown out by the explosions, so we had to move with all our things to Balestra's. We moved there the bunks and our belongings. In the evening of the same day, a 76mm shell hit the house we had left. It broke through the roof and exploded in the part of the house where the soldiers from Conti's platoon lived. White with fear and covered with debris, Corporal Navoni came running to us and told us what had happened. We rushed to the house. I was the first to arrive. The surviving soldiers staggered out into the street. I immediately arranged for 2 wounded men to be taken to Balestra's house. The others were scratched. One of the wounded was continuously making heart-rending screams. When he was laid on a bed, he had a large laceration on his arm, a little above the elbow, and a deep wound on his thigh. We could not take the wounded to the hospital without first dressing their wounds. There was a catastrophic shortage of doctors. No one would even look at them in the hospital until a few days later. And during that time, the unfortunates would simply bleed to death, so I decided to bandage them myself. Fortunately, one of Balestra's soldiers had a dressing bag. As the only surgical instrument, I had to use ordinary household scissors left in the house by the Russian owners. The role of disinfectant was played by melted snow. First, I put cotton swabs on the deep wounds of the first wounded man and tightly bandaged him. Then I carefully washed the numerous bleeding scratches that covered his face and neck. The poor man groaned through his teeth and kept saying in a soft Tuscan accent that his mother had no one but him. I even jokingly reprimanded him, explaining that one does not die from wounds on the arm and leg. What was there to worry about? In the meantime, I had no doubt that this poor man's hour of death was not far off. The other wounded man had a deep wound a little below the armpit. A large piece of shrapnel had pierced his body and was now sticking out of his back near his shoulder blade. He was a very young boy, a child. He said he had been wounded once before, so he knew what it was like. One of Conti's corporals was named Brigina. He was a large man with a permanently scowling expression, a real Sicilian bandit. But I noticed that he was surprisingly loyal to Conti, who was not only his commanding officer, but, most importantly, also a Sicilian. This man always selflessly tended to the wounded and was very upset if he couldn't help. It turned out that the wounded boy and Brigina, from the same village. The corporal spoke to him in Sicilian dialect and gently called him by name. He endeavoured in every way to comfort the wounded man. The boy, who had lost a lot of blood, could hardly stand on yoga. I cut his shirt on him, then with the help of scissors carefully pulled out the splinter, washed the wound, applied cotton swabs to the entry and exit holes, and bandaged it tightly. Standing in the semi-darkness of the room, the other officers silently watched my manipulations, ready to come to my aid at any moment. Suddenly, one of them asked if the scissors were sharp enough and calmly explained that he wanted to trim his fingernails. I glanced at Mario Bellini. He shrugged and shook his head. Something strange was happening to all of us. The wounded were loaded onto a sled, and the soldiers, along with Conti, took them to the hospital. A few days later, Brigina, visiting his countrymen, reported that he was still alive. I never heard from them again. On January 10, we moved to a hut standing in the zone of the 30th Brigade. Of the 1,700 men who were part of our brigade on the banks of the Don, about 300 remained. In our souls we mourned for the dead, but we did our best not to let the bitter memories seize us completely. The neighbourhood Where we moved was located in a lowland and was on the northern outskirts of the city. Outwardly, it did not differ from an ordinary Russian village. One-story huts with thatched roofs and uneven walls did not look reliable. The huts had disproportionately small windows, most often double-framed. Some of them, as well as the doors, had carved wooden platbands which slightly enlivened the appearance. Between the huts there were only a few bare trees. Many of the huts were still inhabited by their owners. But since here, as in most Russian peasant houses, there were sub-floors or cellars next to the house, the Russians preferred to hide in these dens and hardly ever came out. But if in the centre of the city one could not see any locals at all, on the outskirts one could still sometimes meet some Russians, most often women. Wrapped in huge dark shawls, they were carrying heavy buckets from the wells or hurrying somewhere on their errands. Sometimes there were children with them, also wrapped in shawls. Looking at the unfortunate women and destitute children, our hearts shrank with pity. Our new dwelling consisted of 3 rooms. 2 of them were heated. The third, with wooden walls, served as a hallway and also provided some protection from the cold. Soldiers from the 30th Brigade were already here. On the first day we tried to make ourselves comfortable, but on the second day I resolutely moved the furniture left in the warm rooms into the hallway to make it more spacious. There were only 3 metal beds for the officers and straw-filled bunks for the soldiers. Then I made a list of the residents and hung it on the front door. I also received 1 ration card for everyone. The food distribution system in the city had been completely reorganized. As I said, it was divided into sectors and subsectors. Each military unit appointed an officer who received food for everyone and distributed it to the houses in his sector. We, the soldiers of the 30th Brigade, received our provisions from the hands of Captain Verena, who also moved in with us. The system was quite well thought out and worked well, but the food was getting scarcer each time. The General ordered our rations to be cut back so as to last until the end of February. Sometimes we were given a few galettes, half a can of canned food and a handful of pasta per person per day. The wine we used to receive was long ago a memory. The water at the nearest well had a strange brackish taste for some reason, so to get water for drinking we usually melted snow. Sometimes we sent someone to fetch water from the well near the hospital. It was always murky and greenish in colour, but it tasted less nasty than our well. We did not suspect at that time that at the bottom of that well at a depth of 3 or 4 meters lay the corpses of 2 Russians. Later I was told that the hospital knew about it very well, but still we drank water only from there. A large family of locals lived in our hut. They slept in the cellar, but food was cooked on the stove in the hut, so we often met. Among them were a 76-year-old grandfather, a grandmother, a man in his 40s, 2 or 3 women, a small boy and an infant. The man, we learned, had served in peacetime as manager of one of the town's factories. He spoke a little German. We often exchanged food and sometimes had conversations. Our interpreter was Mario Bellini, who had learned Russian quite well during the summer. One of our soldiers, Simato, drew simple pictures, which the Russians liked very much. They especially admired the seascapes. Russian people are very difficult to understand, especially in such difficult conditions. They are children of nature and act impulsively, without reasoning. This can only be compared to the rampage of raging elements on the vast expanses of their boundless country, uncontrollable, unstoppable, and positive and negative impulses coexist peacefully in them until time, and it is never known which will prevail. It's just like in nature. We treated them well, but we noticed that all of them are more or less characterized by fatalism, submission to fate, and as a consequence, inertness and carelessness. And the ideology of materialism instilled in them made them noble or cruel. Communism passed through this land, systematically inciting Russians to hatred and mutual destruction. We were very afraid of captivity only because we were automatically branded as enemies of communism. At the same time, ordinary Russian people can hardly be called champions of the ideas of communism. They are rather its victims, especially the peasants. And now, by a whim of fate, we found ourselves together under one roof. One cannot but note the amazing kindness of Russian women, their capacity for compassion. Wherever we met them, they never refused to help. We understood perfectly well that during our mad march many of our compatriots were saved from frostbite, and thus from death, by simple Russian peasant women, silent and unsmiling. When a shell exploded near our hut, The women only hurriedly crossed themselves and whispered something quietly. Some of my Vekshi, veterans of the 2nd Battery, were quartered in 2 huts next door to us. Corporal Bergi, Pedrolo, Cacciagli, Gola and others. I often went to visit them, and always found the most cordial welcome. Once they treated me to a half-burnt piece of honeycomb that Pedrolo had managed to get out of a burning German warehouse. Sometimes they would come to our house and listen intently to the conversations that were going on between the officers. It was amazingly gratifying to realize that they still trusted me. Quite unexpectedly, I met in Chertkovo with Junior Lieutenant Montresor, the head of my section at the officers' school in Moncalieri. He had wrapped his partially frostbitten legs up to his knees with pieces of blankets, over which he had attached sacking. From the outside, it looked like he was wearing such unusual boots. On evening, while I was with him, several explosions rang out in succession in our sector. Montresor's hut was in another sector. Concerned, I rushed to my own. Fortunately, no one was hurt. The explosions left only deep black craters. During these days, news reached us of the death of my old acquaintance, Califano, the head of the food service. At one time, he had given me 2 handkerchiefs, which I still used. He was killed by a grenade explosion while he was doing his job of preparing food for the soldiers. It happened not far from where Zanotti was buried. Starting January 10, the situation changed. The Russians stopped shelling. Days succeeded each other, and the enemy took no action. Even the Germans, despite their usual equanimity, were puzzled. A German liaison officer who spoke Italian told me that the Russians were probably preparing some unpleasant surprise for us. We Italians regarded the incomprehensible behavior of the Russians quite differently. Hope was revived in our hearts. There were rumors that the Russians who crossed the Don were themselves under the threat of encirclement, so hastily withdraw their forces in the northeastern direction. General X, who always showed restraint at meetings of senior officers, this time was cheerful and very optimistic. They even began to name the dates when fresh forces would approach us and clear the road in 5 days. I began to believe in the future, especially as the sounds of distant battles somewhere in the west were gradually approaching, becoming more and more audible. In that corner of our souls, which was still alive, there was hope again. One morning a carabiner guarding the warehouses came to our hut. He said that during his watch he had seen a long column of enemy vehicles crossing the railroad and moving northward. Are the Russians really retreating? German anti-tank guns opened fire on the silent column. A carabinier, a friend of one of our soldiers, told a strange story that had befallen him in Arbuzov. He was standing in the street in a group of 5 or 6 soldiers when Katyusha shells began to explode around them. His friends fell to the ground, while he himself remained on his feet. When the smoke cleared, the carabinieri was horrified to see that his companions had been torn to shreds in the full sense of the word. One of the soldiers had had his chest ripped open by shrapnel, so that all the internal organs, heart, lungs, stomach, could be seen. As the narrator put it, the shell opened the man like a book. Meanwhile, the carabinieri did not receive a single scratch. Because of the terrible shock, his mind went blank, and he believed that he too had died. He decided that only his soul was alive. In this belief he spent several days. He went to the attacks several times, tried to support his comrades in every possible way, but he did not shoot himself and did not take cover from the enemy's bullets, believing that a dead man cannot be killed twice, and only after he got food and a little regained strength. The carabinieri realized with genuine surprise that he was still alive. Balazi, together with his platoon, returned to our old house. The holes in the walls were hastily patched up, and the window openings were covered with sacking. I visited him often. Conti and Bellestra always kept me company. Sometimes the 3 of us would go to the hospital to see Candela and Lugarisi. Although we had seen a lot and were not afraid of anything, it was nevertheless very difficult for us to be in Lugarisi's room. From his neighbour on the right, who did not get out of bed, there was such a stench that it was difficult to breathe near him. Lugarizzi had been shot in the chest, and in my opinion had already crossed the line that separates a living person from a dead one. I often remember his haggard face, where only his eyes lived. He looked at us attentively, listened to the lively conversation we were having, addressing him too, but who knows if he understood anything. After January 10, Italians were no longer used to work on German positions. Russian civilians and prisoners were now doing it. We often saw German soldiers looking for Russians in the streets. They grabbed everyone, regardless of age, chasing even old men in their 70s to work. Once I rescued an elderly owner of our hut from an absolutely furious German who came to take him to work. The night was very cold. It seemed to me that the unfortunate old man had no chance of surviving until dawn. Later, when it became clear that there were too few Russians, the Germans began to bring in Italians again, and they treated us no better than prisoners. At the request of the German command, shifts were formed in different regiments, which were reported to the headquarters, from where they were sent to the Germans. Every night, the Germans needed 300–400 men. They were digging trenches, communication passages, constructing shelters and building pillboxes. Twice I personally escorted groups of 40 men to headquarters where German officers were waiting impatiently for them. I will not say that we should have refused to do this work, but it was very humiliating. On January 11, the 30th Brigade was ordered to form 4 armed platoons of 15 men each. The old mixed century had by this time been disbanded. The idea of creating new ones, consisting of soldiers from the same pre-existing regiment, was born. Bellini, Antonini, Rigazzoni of the 60th Battalion and myself were ordered to pick out men. I went to the hut where, as far as I knew, 20 soldiers and a sergeant named Marcello Marteno were stationed. I appointed him my deputy and, in addition to him, selected 14 other men. I then divided the platoon into 2 squads, in each of which I appointed a commander and his deputy. Of these men I had previously known only the artilleryman Carrari, who had served on the 1st battery of my battalion. Unlike the other officers, I preferred to recruit soldiers unfamiliar to me. Most likely I would have to lead them to the front line, probably even to death. I decided to spare myself the thought of leading the pathetic remnants of a large family of men, with whom I'd come to be associated over many months, to their deaths. I'd better let them live in peace while I could. I armed my men with rifles and pistols taken from those who were not yet going to fight, and I made sure that everyone had helmets. In my platoon, I established a real military discipline. When I appeared, the sergeant commanded attention, and every 2 hours sent a man to me to find out what orders would be given. Hours passed. Days replaced each other. We lived in constant expectation of some event that never happened. I tried to keep the morale of the soldiers and told them all the good news I could find out. But we had been in the cauldron for almost a month. Too many promises left unfulfilled, too many hopes deceived. We were all depressed by the thought that many people were dead or missing, and the survivors continued to die every day before our eyes. I think that very few others, like me, tried to hope for salvation. The morning came, the air was clean, fresh and surprisingly clear. The houses were dark on the white snow, and black smoke was rising from the stove chimneys into the sky. This is how I often remember Chertkovo even now. Every time I left the house, I would stumble upon the horses standing by the neighbouring hut. Their frosted hides glistened slightly, illuminated by the first rays of the winter sun. No one had tethered them, no one had fed them. But they still stood in the same place, their big heads drooping. These animals must have saved someone's life by carrying them to the city. But now they were tired, cold, and weak without food. Their torsos were also covered with wounds. But the people they had once helped had abandoned them to their fate. Every time I entered the door, I hoped I would never see those gaunt figures again, a mute rebuke to humanity. I believed that someone would take them somewhere far away. I finally decided to find some shelter for the poor animals myself, but I was too late. They were already dead. Their meat was eaten by everyone. We spent most of the day sitting or lying on the mattresses. Our main activity was to scrutinize our dirty underwear for the most malignant lice. Time passed. Nothing happened. In the hut where my Vecchi from the 2nd Battery lived, a Tuscan named Cacciarelli suddenly fell ill. He was lying on a mattress and shaking with fever. What could we do? What could we do? We could only wait. The man had to make it on his own or die. We were very concerned about the fate of the hospital patients, whose number had already reached 2,000. One of the 3 doctors who worked here, falling down from fatigue, once told me, without caring that the patients could hear him, that if nothing changed in a week, half of these unfortunates would go to the grave. He grimly parted his hands, shook his head, and went back to work. He and Captain Ruocco worked under inhuman conditions. Sometimes they had to amputate gangrenous limbs with kitchen knives and dangerous razors. In the main building, the situation became perilous. The stairs and floors in the unheated corridors were covered with a thin crust of ice, making it difficult and dangerous to move about. Entering any room, the first thing we saw was a thick fog descending from the ceiling and slightly dissipating about a metre above the floor. Beneath this mist, on straw thrown on the floor, lay the wounded, the remains of their clothes moving with lice. And he lay like this for weeks. Death with his scythe was a frequent guest in these gloomy rooms. Every morning the wounded would look at their comrades who had died during the night and were carried out by soldiers specially appointed for this purpose. I remember well the face of a soldier with a thick red beard. He was from the village next to mine. He was placed with Candela, and always when I went to visit my friend I was sure to have a few words with him. The last time I saw him, he was lying on the straw, trembling and crying. He was begging in vain for help. The neighbours said he had a high fever. I remembered another soldier, though I still don't know his name. Thirsty, he came out of the hospital, ignoring the infernal pain in his frostbitten and gangrenous legs, and went to a well where both soldiers and civilians took drinking water. When he felt unable to go any further, he sat down on the ground and burst into angry tears, shaking an empty German flask which he had never managed to fill. I came up and looked into the characteristic face of the southerner. Poor Italian infantryman. I had nothing with me with which to get water, so I borrowed a bucket for a few minutes from a girl who came to the well. Out of the corner of my eye I noticed that she, having filled the bucket, was almost running away from the well. January 12, Mario Bellini, along with Rigazzoni, left for a joint operation with the Germans. He departed with 100 soldiers and 2 sergeants, Breda and Pilone. Bellini looked worried. None of us knew what joint operation with the Germans. Who could have guessed that we would meet again only many years later in Italy? His place in the hut was immediately taken by the artillery captain Magaldi. This young officer was in good physical shape, but had a very frail physique. He made himself comfortable on Bellini's bed, which stood near the wall behind which was the stove. At night it heated the room, and during the day the Russian women cooked food on it. The place proved too hot for Magaldi. In the morning he felt bad, complaining of a headache and chills. We had to rearrange the furniture in the room to move his bed closer to the window. Along with the captain, his resident Belligente moved in. The little guy wasn't so lucky. He had gotten surrounded only a few days before his return to Italy, so he, like several others in a similar position, did not receive winter uniforms and began the retreat in summer, canvas uniforms. He successfully replaced Mario Bellini in the role of interpreter, because he was very vigorously gibbering in Russian. It was January 15. The Russians had not made themselves known lately. We thought that around Chertkovo remained only a few units, covering the withdrawal of the main Russian forces to the Don. Only forward. At 6 o'clock in the evening of January 15 came an urgent order to prepare to leave the city in 2 hours. It was already quite dark when I was sent to Captain Veroni, who was in charge of food distribution. He ordered me to get 2 days' rations and go at once to Major Wu, who was urgently collecting officers. I visited the Major, then returned to Verona to find out the details. All Italians who were able to walk were to line up and prepare to march no later than 8 o'clock. The Germans decided to make an attempt to break the encirclement ring. When the road would be free, we would march toward Belovetsk, that is, westward. In front of Belovetsk, which is about 60 kilometers away, there are German positions. Nobody knew how far these new German positions were from Chertkovo, maybe 20 or 30 kilometers. Well, in any case, not 8 kilometers as the Germans recently boasted, so the long-awaited reinforcements did not come again. And anyway, did these new German positions west of Chertkovo really exist? We didn't believe in anything anymore. All our hopes were based on the sounds of distant battle, which were certainly something real. Our ears cannot deceive everyone at the same time, but what if it was a garrison as surrounded as ours, trying to break out of the ring? Such a possibility cannot be discounted either. And there was one other thought that more or less troubled everyone. We were about to save our own lives, in other words, the pitiful remnants of what not so long ago had been an excellent Army Corps. But what about the 2,000 wounded and frostbitten who could not walk, and thus had to stay in Chertkovo? In the hospital, in the infirmary, and in the numerous huts, scattered all over the town, we lived the same life with them. They had the same hopes and were tormented by the same fears as we were. They fought with us and, like us, suffered from the murderous climate, and now we were abandoning them, leaving them in the hands of the enemy. I tried not to think about it. Verena ordered me to go round all the huts. without exception, in which soldiers from the 30th Brigade were stationed to order the men to receive 2 days' rations urgently, and to warn those who could walk to be ready to go to work in the positions for a few days. The assembly was appointed in front of Verena's house. From all the huts a messenger was to come to us every 2 hours to keep in touch. A few days earlier we had drawn up a detailed plan of our zone, so I had no difficulty in getting around the huts. I was accompanied by Sergeant Martano, my platoon's deputy commander. He once told me that he had had a strange dream from which it was clear that on January 16 an important event would take place. Now he remembered it and could not calm down. In some huts, soldiers of the 30th Brigade lived together with soldiers from other units, and they already knew the news. Everyone discussed our departure from the city, and without adding the phrase to work in German positions. With it, Verena wanted to keep those who could not walk from despair. In the last or penultimate house I saw Caporalino, the little signalman from the 2nd Battery whom I had helped in the Valley of Death. He greeted me cheerfully and immediately informed. "I can't go to work, Signor Tenente. I'm wounded, you know that." "Listen," I frowned. "It's not about the works. This is something else. Pack up and go out with everyone else. You can take that as an order." "Yes, sir, if you say so." I never saw him again, but I know he went back to Italy. When we'd finished our rounds of the huts, we went back to our quarters. Martano, who had been sent to headquarters for news, returned and reported that preparations for departure were well underway. If, after my conversation with Verena, I had not yet been quite sure that the alarm would not prove false. Now I, too, began to pack. One of the soldiers who had gone with Bellini returned, and told me that that evening the Germans had parted with their old uniforms and put on new ones. We ate a heavy meal and said our evening prayers, thanks to which our house remained unharmed, while all the neighbouring ones, to a greater or lesser extent, suffered from the shelling. Then we rubbed anti-frostbite ointment on our feet and dressed warmly. I now had a pair of new socks and a nice pair of top warm stockings, Gamache, a gift from Valorzi. The problem of wet feet that had plagued me before was solved once and for all. I also got a pair of army mittens, which, if I did not wear them, hung from a lanyard around my neck in the German fashion. We spent the last hours in the hut lying quietly on the bunks. The orderlies started to cook macaroni, but had no time to finish what they had started. It was time to leave. The macaroni was left to the Russians. Captain Magaldi, who continued to be tormented by a headache, decided to go with everyone. The clock showed the beginning of 8. I ordered my men to dress and go out to line up on the road in front of the hut. What awaited us now? Would we be able to get the long-awaited freedom that had been looming ahead, but had slipped away at the last moment? I mentally asked for God's help. Reginato, my orderly, in Chertkovo, always carried my camera around his neck. Now, when he saw that I had taken it myself, he said bitterly, "You decided to carry it yourself, Signor Tenente, because you realize that I can't get there." And he pointed to his frostbitten feet. "What nonsense!" I exclaimed and handed him the camera. "What makes you think you can't walk? Carry it, please, if you want." "No, why should I indulge in foolishness? I'll carry it myself." Judging by his confused, sad look, I didn't convince him. And Reginato really didn't make it. When the men formed up, Antonini and I took our place at the head of the column, and we set off. The snow crunched loudly under our feet. The frost did not wait long, and immediately began to work hard upon its captives, penetrating under our clothes, biting and pinching us on all sides. Captain Magaldi was one of the last to go, almost hanging on the arm of his orderly Belligenti. Suddenly he demanded to be taken back to the house. He declared that he could not walk. No matter how hard we tried, it was impossible to get him to make an effort. Belligenti ran back to the hut and secured a promise from the Russian landlord that he would take the sick man to the hospital the next day. In a neighbouring hut remained Junior Lieutenant Salvador, a native of Trieste, who served in the 62nd Battalion, near Major Wu's dwelling. Many people had gathered. Everyone was waiting. The soldiers found familiar faces in the crowd and made lively conversations. I joined my platoon. More than an hour passed like that. We saw that the road leading to the city centre was gradually filling up with people. The general column was quite accommodating in the street of a small provincial town. We were a far cry from the endless stream of people that moved along the snow-covered roads during the first days of the retreat. We walked for a while between the houses, then joined the general column. Eventually moved forward, Torino Division first, followed by Pasubio, then the rest of the army. Being an artillery brigade of an army corps, we were at the back of the procession. The Germans marched ahead along with several Italian units that were to assist during the breakthrough. Very slowly, constantly stopping, we crossed a small square where the tanks stood, then went through the centre of the city. I couldn't even believe that we were seeing these places for the last time. I tried to remember everything as accurately as possible. As we approached the railroad, an officer called out to me from a passing sledge. It was Triossi, whom we had met many times at the hospital. I immediately asked him about Candela and received a reassuring answer. It turned out that he was somewhere ahead of me, also riding a sled. The stops followed one after another. Some lasted forever. Often machine gun bursts came to our ears. Obviously, the Russians were nervous. Above our positions towards which we were marching, not even flashes could be seen. Perhaps they had long since been abandoned. Time stretched on interminably. We were still within the city limits. The main danger to us that night was the frost. The temperature, judging by my sensations, had fallen below 30 degrees, and we bore it with great difficulty. People were increasingly looking longingly at the houses along the road. They looked incredibly attractive. Eventually, the soldiers began to separate from the column in groups and enter the houses. The hard-won order had been disrupted. With each passing hour, the organized military unit began to look more and more like a mob. In the end, there was almost nothing left of the column. In the company of Antonini and Martano, I also went into the house. The Germans were already there. Then we looked into one of the cellars. In it, we found a soldier who had lost part of his leg, but he still intended to try his luck and wanted to walk on a long, knotted stick that he had adapted for this purpose. When we got out of the cellar, we took a few steps and came upon 5 or 6 corpses lying in the middle of the dark road. It appeared that a shell had fallen directly on the column. The second house had already been abandoned by the Germans. We searched for a candle burner and lit it. On the table were plates with leftovers, butter, honey, apples. Here I noticed an Odyss. Next to it lay a pile of buttons with numbers embossed on them. All of them were turned upside down so that the numbers were not visible. And only one button was lying with the number up, and it was the number 13. Outside again. The frost seemed to be getting worse by the minute. On the snow were blackened, abandoned German trucks. The road went upward, and soon the town was left behind. Only a lone hut or stable stood by the roadside. We figured we had left the town to the south or southeast. The stable was dark and cold. Further away stretched the vast steppe. We spent many hours here. The room was so crowded that it was impossible to walk through without stepping on someone. We had to go to the door frequently to make sure we were keeping up with the column. Leaning against the wall, I fell asleep standing up. Then I heard someone calling my name. Although I was half asleep, I nevertheless felt that something was wrong. It was Lieutenant Maestri, commander of the 30th Brigade. The extreme cold had given him a heart attack. He was very ill. When his men said they saw me, he asked me to come over. It seemed to me that he already had one foot in the other world. Antonini and I sat down beside him on the ground. The sick man lay stretched out on the straw. The flame of the burning candles only slightly dispelled the darkness. Maestri did not move, but breathed heavily and unevenly. He complained of Wu, who always demanded the impossible of him, and that was why he was so tired. He realized that he would remain here on the straw, left to his own fate, but he hoped that if the halt was prolonged, he would recover in time. His orderly silently huddled on the sidelines, seemed utterly dumbfounded. He couldn't understand the commander's insistence on leaving him here. But, fortunately for Maestri, the stop had lasted 3 or even 4 hours, and he was relieved. Looking out once again, we found that the tail of the column was already a good 100 meters ahead. It was time to go outside. It was getting harder and harder to bear the searing cold. How much more could we endure if after every 2 steps we had to stop for an hour? Behind us we saw a huge red glow. It was burning German warehouses. No one set fire to our warehouses. The doctor who remained in the hospital, who spoke a little Russian, was given the task to explain to the enemy that we had saved the warehouses, especially for our wounded. What will happen to them? The thought of the unfortunates made me shudder. Perhaps the Russians are already in the city. How slowly time crawls. Lord, help us to see the dawn. The cold caused unimaginable suffering. Looking at the crouched, bent figures, I began to feel little by little that I had ceased to be a rational and independent human being. I became the smallest atom of suffering humanity, a tiny particle of universal pain and sorrow. Later, I thought about the feeling I had experienced at that time many times, but I was never able to express it clearly in words. We are all individualists, and it is impossible to describe that at some point one's own self becomes unimportant, dissolved into something incommensurably huge. We all offered prayers for the atonement of our sins. When at last we walked faster, it was already dawning. I was always afraid that we would have to stop again, but we did not slow down. Very often there were abandoned trucks covered with snow on the road. There was a rumor that the Germans kept us so long to use us as a kind of shield while they tried to breathe life into these vehicles. The main part of the German column was far ahead. January 16. The day had not yet begun when we crossed the abandoned Russian positions. Everywhere. In the gun pits on the road, in general, wherever you look, lay the bodies of Russian soldiers. They had already frozen, turned into blocks of ice. Some of them were in very strange poses. One, for example, had his legs bent as if he were on his knees, and his arms outstretched as if he were aiming a gun at someone. But only he was lying on his side and had no weapon in his hands. On all sides of the snow could be seen the tracks left by the tracks of heavy tanks. And the road went uphill. This section we overcame almost running. In an abandoned German truck lay a wounded German, a large, fair-haired and blue-eyed Irian. He scrutinized everyone who ran by and looked into the truck. The guy was wearing a new white uniform. Who knows with what mood he had put on that garment as recently as this morning. Now it wouldn't be hours before it became his shroud. Move. Keep moving. The frost had increased again. It was at least 40 degrees. Snow covered our faces. Crusts of ice froze on our helmets near our nostrils. The road went up. Shots were heard ahead. Somewhere nearby there was a battle. The time was nearing noon. The road passed over a small hillside and went downhill again. Up and down, up and down. It was like a roller coaster. This terrain was to continue all the way to Belovsk. One could see that far below. The village huts pressed on both sides of the road. The ones nearest to it were burning. Between them was a Russian grenade launcher, which was shelling the column on the opposite slope, where the Germans and the Torino division were now. There was return fire from the column. We would have to pass through this village. We listened to the bursts of Russian machine guns. Almost all the Italians who had guns were walking at the head of the column. The Germans had promised to put 2 battalions in the rear guard, but had not done so. They may not have had enough men, though. Antonini and I marched at the head of Pasubio's division. At first the seniors were careful that Pasubio's soldiers did not mix with Torino's soldiers. But when our part of the column opened fire from machine guns, no one could no longer hold the soldiers, and they rushed headlong down the slope. Whoever ran faster, the one who got ahead. Now the whole column was running, and it was pointless to try to establish order. Antonini and I tried to keep together. Below everything was covered with thick smoke. Russian Katyusha were firing. The shells exploded on both sides of the road, but, surprisingly, none of them fell on it, so people were not hurt. After a while, we heard the familiar sound again, followed by a series of explosions, this time on the right side of the road. Underflight. Most of all, I was afraid that the cursed witch Katyusha would come to the column from behind and scour it with fire. That's when no one would feel bad. Another shell hit a truck that had stalled at the foot of the hill. Several men fell to the ground. In our part of the column, almost no one had weapons. We also lacked discipline. Only the pitiful remnants of Russians who had managed to slip away from the Germans could hide between the houses. But for us, thousands of unarmed people, they posed a serious threat. Panic cannot be overcome. Fear is a normal expression of the human instinct for self-preservation. Depending on the character of the individual, it can be subdued by reason. Sometimes it can be suppressed by a sense of duty, but not panic. Seized by panic, man ceases to be the master of himself. He is not able to control his actions. Obstacles that in other circumstances he would overcome with ease, he becomes insurmountable. Many of us once showed valor in battles, coped with any difficulties, showing ourselves at our best. But at that moment no one thought about it. Even those who had weapons in their hands were incapable of making a sensible decision and trying to resist the obviously small number of the enemy. People were running away in panic, running headlong and without seeing the road. Disaster! As we entered the village, the front ranks of the column stopped. Everyone huddled on the road, not daring to pass the last row of houses, behind which the column was shot at by the enemy. Did they not realize that delay was fatal? What could be easier than to shoot a frantic crowd? I shouted at the top of my voice, "Go on, or it'll be too late." Little by little, the people moved forward. We walked down the white snow-covered slope. Not a speck of it was visible anywhere on all sides. My only desire at that moment was to get away quickly. We were the perfect target here. Every second I was waiting to die. Away we saw several dead and wounded. Both Germans and Italians were victims of the same shell. A wounded German was on his knees, leaning heavily on the snow with one hand. With the other he was reaching out to us as if calling for someone to take his hand and lead him. The Italian lying in the snow also looked at us with frightened, widened eyes. In a trembling voice he kept repeating, "Signor?" After a while we entered a stretch of road literally littered with the bodies of Russians. The wreckage of sledges was also scattered here. Obviously these people were trying to get away from the chase, but the German tank was faster. A little to the side lay the body of a Russian officer. On the white road I noticed a small black object. On closer examination it turned out to be a small prayer book, probably lost by one of my compatriots. I picked up the little book and put it in my pocket. Let it remain as a memento. We must go forward. Antonini walked even faster than me. I warned him several times not to waste his strength. There are still 50 kilometers to go. The column was stretched out a lot. Behind us it was black, in front black and white. We began to catch up with the Germans. On the side of the road stood abandoned German trucks, turning back and looking from above at the village, through which the column was still passing. We could see that small figures of men dressed in khaki were moving behind the houses on the left. There were no more than 20 of them. They were Russians, who must have watched our escape with considerable surprise. We passed the Germans who had gone to a haystack by the road to defecate. Then we overtook an elderly German soldier who was trying very hard to keep up with the others, but he was not very good at it. And from the direction of the village, we could still sometimes hear the sound of machine gun bursts. It seemed that everyone, not only Antonini and I, was always waiting for the shells to whistle over our heads again. So at some point the column spontaneously shifted to the left and trampled a fairly wide road running parallel to the main road. After a few kilometers both roads merged into one. We passed 2 Germans who were pulling a boat-shaped sled, on which lay their wounded comrade, probably someone's brother. It was clear that they were in great distress. From time to time they asked someone for help, but every time in vain. The Katyushas were no longer firing. We breathed more freely, but continued to move forward quickly. The snow became deep. In order not to fall through, we tried to move on the rut left by the tanks. We overcame 2 more slides in complete silence. Only the squeak of snow under our feet was heard. The day was sunny and clear. On both sides of the road stretched an endless snow-covered steppe, and there was not a hut anywhere, not a hint of habitation. Strong gusts of wind occasionally threw snow charges at people. We felt alone and lost in the vast white desert. Now the column moved almost without stopping. It seemed to me that nature was completely indifferent to all our pathetic attempts to survive. What are we in comparison? A miserable bunch of ants scurrying about? In other words, nothing. It is as immeasurably great as we are insignificantly small. I never experienced that most unpleasant feeling again. And then I realized why Russians build such unreliable houses and cemeteries that disappear from the face of the earth over the years. They submit to the will of nature and do not want to go against it in anything. Far ahead, silent airplanes appeared in the sky and began to describe circles. Russians? Germans? Judging by the manner of flight with frequent transitions into a steep dive, they were Germans. Soon they were surrounded by red clouds left by the explosions of anti-aircraft shells. Forward, only forward. At one place the road passed over a small bridge, thrown over a gully. At the bottom we saw a huge German tank, abandoned. Nearby lay the bloody uniform of a tank driver. On the roadside near the bridge stood a German anti-tank gun, staring at the tank with its formidable muzzle. No one was visible near it. Obviously it was used by the Russians to hit the tank. But then where were the gunners? Forward again. We began to notice clear signs of panic among the Germans leading the column. On the road more and more often seen abandoned equipment, broken boxes of ammunition, machine gun ribbons, which usually Germans wear around their necks. Something happened. We have to go. Antonini and I tried to move as fast as possible. We had to get to the German part of the column at all costs and find out what was going on there. From time to time we wondered how things ended in that village behind Chertkovo, where the column was attacked. And only later we learned that the Russians, and there were about 30 of them, eventually managed to split the column into two parts. First they shelled it from afar, causing serious damage and panic, and then they set up two guns right on the road and cut the column. Witnesses said that 400–500 of our compatriots, mostly wounded and frostbitten, who could not walk fast and were in the tail, were captured by the Russians. They were dispersed into huts, and a sentry was placed near each hut. Some Italians managed to slip away, and they caught up with us later. I also heard that between the huts there was a stationary Russian tank, from which a single machine gunner was firing. A gradually increasing cold wind was blowing from the east. From time to time it threw snow charges on the road. The frost was becoming unbearable. During our stay in Chertkovo there were few such frosty days. Shortly before the second stop, Antonini asked me to go slower. Ahead, at the foot of another slope, a village appeared. We decided to stop there for a drink of water. Clutching our pistols in our hands, we entered the hut. It was warm and very stuffy, as it usually is in Russian huts, where the windows are not open. Without saying a word, the woman handed us a mug of water. Forward again. Something strange was clearly going on in the column. The Germans formed a platoon, which did not let the Italians forward, and there was no way to get past them. We were joined by Belligenti, Captain Magaldi's orderly. We came to the foot of a broad, gentle, and very long slope. A halt. The column stretched across the slope and stood motionless. There must have been a battle somewhere ahead. It was midday. Airplanes were flying in the clear, pale blue sky. The air shook with the roar of sirens. We watched in silence as the winged machines entered a dive, then quickly gained altitude. We saw dark barrel bombs fly downward and then explode, sending giant columns of black smoke into the air. The rumble of the explosions must have travelled very far across the snowy desert. The column huddled together near the top of the slope. A small hill rising to the left of the road hid the valley from us. It was there that small groups of Germans dressed in white were heading. They were setting up machine guns. Some white figures stood motionless, gazing somewhere in front of them, while others fussed about the guns. Over the valley, too, airplanes were flying. They dived into deadly dives, dropped bombs, flew away. They were immediately replaced by the next. In the sky constantly circled 5 or 6 birds. Here, on the new line of fortifications formed recently, the Russians, having found that we left Chertkovo, transferred significant forces. In addition, they hid 4 tanks and an armoured car between the huts. When the vanguard forces of the Germans had already passed most of the village and opened fire in the hope of breaking through the line of fortifications, Russian tanks appeared from their hiding places and raced straight at the column, sweeping away everything in their path. The German troops scattered at first, but very soon news of the attack spread throughout the column, and 4 tanks immediately returned. Undermining under themselves and their own infantry, they rushed at the Russians. A lightning battle ensued. All Russian tanks were hit. An armoured car tried to escape, but was overtaken by German tank fire. One of the Russian tanks was taken in tow as a war trophy. The column set off again. I was told that the very airplanes diving over the valley later chased the rest of the enemy tanks for a long time, preventing them from bypassing us and attacking from behind. I don't know the people from whom I heard this too well, so I can't vouch for the accuracy of the information, but I believe it is quite reliable. Now a crowd of people was rushing up the slope. The Italian column had once again ceased to be a military unit. It had become a collection of frightened people, unable to control their actions. Slowly swirling snowflakes glistened and shimmered under the winter sun. Suddenly shells sprinkled into the sea of people. Only one mortar was firing, and it was of a small caliber. But when a shell hits a dense crowd, every shrapnel is sure to find its victim. I myself saw the top half of a man's head flying in the air with his hair fluttering in the wind. The planes picked up a Russian mortar. 2 pickets, 4 bombs, and the ravine where it was hidden turned out to be torn apart by the explosions. Many years later, a USU junior lieutenant told me that one of the shrapnel had neatly cut off his soldier's balls. The unlucky kid tightly bandaged the wound, picked up the eggs lying on the snow, put them in his pocket and went on. In Belovodsky approached the UUE and showed him the still bleeding wound and the shriveled and blackened testicles lying in the palm of his hand among the crumbs of biscuit. The poor man was very interested in whether he could have them sewn back on at the hospital. At last we reached the top of the slope and were able to see the village where the battle was going on. Antonini had cheered up a little and was now walking quite fast, holding on to the harness of the horse walking beside him. I was very tired, but I tried to keep up my pace. I was very much afraid that the unprotected rearguard could at any moment be attacked by Russian tanks. And here in front of us the first huts. And the snow, dead Germans. Nearby burned enemy tanks. Little ahead, buried in the snow, a Russian tank. It was so deep that only the top of the gun turret was visible above the snowdrift. Behind it hid the very malicious mortar that was firing on the column. Several huts were burning. Their walls were licked by red flames that seemed surprisingly bright against the white snow. On the side of the road, a Russian old man with a long white beard was stubbornly trying to douse his burning house with water. Not realizing the futility of his actions, he again and again dragged water from the well and splashed it on the fire. Obviously, he had to do something to keep from going mad. And high in the sky the airplanes were roaring, making their dizzying peaks. At the end of the village we saw many bodies of Russian soldiers. One of them was wearing an Italian fur coat. We passed Lieutenant Mastri, who had already fully recovered. He was walking along with a small group of officers led by Major W. I wanted to join them, but Antonini did not agree. In this village the horse that was carrying Lieutenant Zanetti had fallen. Convinced of the futility of trying to walk on the gangrene-stricken Yogi, Zanetti asked some of the soldiers to take him to the nearest hut and leave him there. But he could not wait quietly for death. After a while he left the hut and followed the column on all fours. Looking ahead, I will say that he survived, but lost both his legs. Later I learned that Candela also had to overcome most of the way on foot, and he was seriously frostbitten. And Lugarezzi and his faithful orderly Baza, both seriously frostbitten, followed the column for interminably long hours. They were surrounded only by a vast, snow-covered plain and silence, occasionally broken by the ominous howling of the wind. Leaving the village behind, we came to a long, shallow gully. The bodies of dead Russian soldiers were often found in it, too. German tanks had ploughed the snow here. Suddenly 3 airplanes appeared on the right. They clearly held a course for the head part of the column, hidden from us by tall vegetation. Were they Russians or Germans? From afar it was impossible to make out. Soon we received an exhaustive answer to our question. Airplanes flew over the column, pouring machine gun fire from above. People hid wherever they could. I fell to the ground and crawled away from the road. When the planes flew over our heads, Antonini and I got to our feet. We were fortunate that the Russians were completely untalented aviators. Shooting at the unarmed column, they managed to kill only 1 man. A long halt. It was getting dark. The wind, which during the day had been growing weaker and weaker again, and constantly changing direction, was now blowing from the south, but it was no warmer, and it was penetrating to the bones. I tirelessly stomped my feet, jumped up and down, and sometimes ran on the spot to stay warm. I should have taken advantage of the stop to get some refreshment. I had some galettes and canned meat with me, but the meat had turned into a lump of ice, from which I was able to break off only a few small fragments with a paint knife. Then we tried to bring at least some semblance of order to the column, and again to divide the huddled men into Torino and Pasubio. But we quickly realized it was useless. We were joined by Junior Lieutenant Conti, with whom we lived in Chertkovo in one hut. To escape the cold, we, like many around us, sat tightly pressed together and covered ourselves with my blanket on top. It didn't help much. Not far away, I heard an unfamiliar voice speaking in an old Milanese dialect. I could hardly believe my ears. It was so strange to hear my mom's voice in this horrible place, when she used to sing us lullabies and we were still children. I felt so sad, tears came to my eyes. No, we can't relax. This is not the time. Why did the stop take so long? How much longer do we have to go? And is it true that we have to get to the surrounded German garrison and help him break through the ring? Soon the frost was becoming intolerable. Although we could hardly keep on our feet from fatigue, we were still forced to be constantly on the move. Our hopes were fading. We set off again when the sky ahead took on a threatening purple hue. The airplanes made farewell circles over the column and disappeared from sight. We had turned right and were now heading straight north. Why that way? Our route took us through a thicket of very tall dead grass. It seemed as if we were walking down a long corridor between two walls. There was the occasional sound of gunfire in the distance. We made a few more short stops, but on the whole the column went faster again. It was even possible to establish a relative order. A few sergeants from the Bersagliers had divided the men into Torino and Pasubio, and were now vigilant to make sure that the ranks did not mix again. To do this, they had to shout incessantly at the soldiers who did not want to obey discipline. Sometimes they even fired in anger in the air. The grass ended. In front of us was again a flat, snow-covered lowland. We walked on and kept looking to the west, expecting at any moment to see our lines of fortifications. But instead we were once again greeted by the famous Russian Katyushas. Their shells fell in the snow a little away from us, enveloping the column in clouds of golden smoke. So the enemy is waiting for us here too. We must go forward, and try not to think about anything. Antonini and I somehow imperceptibly crossed the demarcation line between Torino and Pasubio. I saw a few tiredly walking familiar officers. It was getting dark. We turned left. Our course now lay westward again. The column stretched, thinned, and finally broke up into several isolated groups. At the head were the Germans and part of the Italians, then, in some distance, Pasubio. In the tail of the column stretched a disorganized crowd of Italians, and the groups were separated by quite a long distance. If the tail of the column, consisting entirely of unarmed men, were attacked by the enemy, it is not difficult to suppose how the matter would end. We entered a village. I think it was Chertkovo. Now perhaps we all, not excluding the Germans, were like hackneyed nags. I asked Antonini to stay with Belligente for a while and catch my breath. I, on the other hand, intended to get to the beginning of the Italian column and try to clear up the situation. My nerves were so tense that I could not walk slowly. In the darkness I noticed Germans stationed between the huts. Perhaps they were taking up positions? "So you want to leave me? You call yourself my friend?" I silently rushed forward, mentally justifying that I was not obliged to bear the outbursts of irritation and anger of even the best friends. But if you wanted to, you could find an excuse for any behaviour, even the most unworthy, and the truth was that I was no longer in control of myself. It wasn't long before I heard Antonini's voice calling my name. I didn't answer. I had abandoned my friend. I was now alone. Katyusha shells rained down on the village. The Germans lay huddled on the ground and did not even try to return fire. Bright flashes of explosions illuminated the figures huddled in the snow. It seems that no one was hurt. "Let's go." We had already reached the last houses when several more shells exploded nearby. Ahead began another gentle slope with no end in sight. The single column was now split into two, moving in parallel. On the left side were vehicles including a few Italian ones, and a mile and a half or 2 kilometers to the right snaked a seemingly endless chain of men. Before starting the ascent, I hustled into the nearest hut to take a short break in the warmth of the room. Finding that there was no room for me there, I sat down tiredly beside the unfamiliar soldiers on the snow, with my back against the wall of some dilapidated building. The frost, apparently, decided to test all its bogateer strength on us. A few more minutes of immobility and I would never be able to get up. I started to climb in the column of transport. There were some sledges with Italians in them. I hoped that Antonini had managed to find a place on them and decided to look for him. But my long wanderings in the darkness between the sledges and loud shouting did not yield any result. Then I ordered myself to think no more of my friend. I needed to concentrate all my energy on moving on. How much longer could I hold out? German trucks, spitting out puffs of smoke, stretched up the slope. Their wheels seemed remarkably black against the white snow. Skinny horses pulled the overloaded sleds up the slope with incredible effort. The lives of many people depended on the endurance of these unpretentious animals. It was as if the wind had decided to blow us out of the world. With maniacal persistence, it tried to penetrate under our clothes and blow the remnants of life out of our exhausted bodies. As if it were the greatest pleasure, we dreamed of lying for a few hours on the floor of some shack, even the most poor one. We did not even dream of such a miracle as warmth. The main thing was to have walls to protect us from the penetrating wind. I was walking and thinking about our rulers who had gotten involved in the war. Now they were in faraway Rome, in the familiar comfort of their luxurious dwellings, sleeping on soft beds. Yet they sent their soldiers to fight in this murderous climate without even bothering to dress for it. What can you call them? Scoundrels, sons of bitches. That's an... Though I now believe that they too, like all of us, were nothing more than tools in the hands of Providence. Obviously, each of us felt the same way to one degree or another. That is why we were much less likely to discuss or grumble about our rulers in difficult times than when things were going well. It seemed incredible to us that the terrible events in which we were involved depended on the will of a few small people. These people are our punishment, and God alone can punish mankind. There is no other way to explain war. Even if we get through it and find a way to convey the real meaning of war to others, especially to the direct perpetrators, wars will still continue in the future against human logic. Yes, and in the past, man has never desired war. But to really prevent them, a joint effort of all mankind is needed. People must stop making wars inevitable by continuing to sin daily and hourly. Human sins tend to accumulate and eventually become an uncontrollable avalanche that begins to move, crushing everything in its path, maiming and killing. I noticed Artillery Captain Trevulzi on a sledge passing me, poking his head out from under the blanket with which he was covering himself. When he saw me, he instantly hid under the blanket, as if he were afraid of my evil eye. Pretending that I did not understand the hint, I rushed after the sledges and followed them for quite a long time with the tenacity of a machine gun, as if tied. Soon the column stopped, and I sat down tiredly on the edge of the sled. The captain began to look at me in a frankly hostile manner, and it finally dawned on me that I had better get away. I tried to get on another sled, which I thought was Italian, but the Germans were there and immediately drove me off. I had to keep going. The road kept going up. It was flat, wide and white. I forgot for a second about the bitter frost and fierce wind and looked around. To our right stretched a snow-covered steppe, somewhere near the horizon line ending with a forest. To the left stretched the same white desert, which was cut only by the dark snake of the column. The enormity of the space around us was overwhelming and overwhelming. Eventually the climb ended. I came out onto the plain again. We passed several firing points with German guns mounted there. I remember well that in front of them lay many corpses of Russian soldiers. One of them, apparently an Asiatic, was left across the road. I noticed his thick, good-quality helmet, which protected his face well. I decided to take it off. It wasn't easy because the dead man's ears were frozen, turning into chunks of ice. But I managed it, and only then I discovered that the helmet was covered with a crust of blood. The dead soldier's broad face was also frozen with a bloody mask. I pulled the helmet over mine. It soon warmed up and began to emit a strange odour. The smell of a Siberian, I thought, but now I didn't need to cover my head with a blanket. Various events happened on that slope. Some of them I don't even want to remember. It's embarrassing. One Italian officer offered the Germans 1,000 marks for letting him sit on a sled for 10 minutes. The Germans agreed, but after 3 minutes they pocketed the money and threw him out into the snow. The Italian had one foot in the grave and could not defend himself. Another gave his gold watch for a similar favour. People dying of fatigue offered their pistols to the Germans, which were very popular among them. A German sergeant, pacing along the road with a group of his comrades, told me quite amiably in French that we were already in our own territory. It seems that at that moment I had not yet realized the importance of this information. We were out of the cauldron. The German also said that 20 kilometers ahead was the town of Belovodsk, not far from which Italian and German trucks were waiting for us, which would take us to the town. I had a bitter thought that the German trucks would certainly be there, but we were unlikely to wait for the Italian ones. And I was right. We got on a good road with signs on the side of the road. On all sides we could see the familiar earth mounds with their smoky chimneys sticking out. I remembered again our dugouts on the Don. There was no mistake. We had really come out of the cauldron. And I no longer have to run forever, fleeing like a hunted animal, feeling that death is breathing down my neck. I would see my family again, my home, my Italy. Was I supposed to scream, laugh, dance with happiness? I guess I should. I bowed my head and offered a prayer to the Madonna who kept me alive. I continued walking, only now I was thinking about those who remained there on the cold roads from Don to Belovodsk. I hoped that many of them were alive, though they had fallen into the hands of the enemy, or perhaps they had all been killed. My friend Chertkovo. He was last seen running to the attack. He was shouting and laughing, and blood was gushing from a laceration in his leg, said Montresor. It seemed to me now that Chertkovo was looking at me, and his face kept the same expression I remembered from looking at my friend in Death Valley. Where are the soldiers of my battalion now? Loyal, faithful comrades with whom I'd lived soul to soul for many months. They tried very hard to save themselves, but failed, fell behind. Our mothers are waiting for us at home too, sine tenenti, but now we will not return to them. Chutney people were left dead on that road, and not only Italians, there were no less Russians. We should not forget about the Germans, first of all about those who died trying to clear the way for us. And I began to pray fervently for the dead. According to our calculations, of the 30,000 Italians who served in the 35th Army Corps, which were surrounded on the Don, about 8,000 reached Chertkovo. On the evening of January 15, we made a count of troops. It turned out to be about 7,000. About 5,000 people left Chertkovo. From the cauldron got out no more than 4,000. Of them, at least 3,000 were wounded or seriously frostbitten. But even among the survivors were not healthy. Nervous disorders, diseases after spending a month in the encirclement, quite a good army corps turned into a handful of exhausted cripples who could barely stay on their feet. They weren't even people, but their shadows. A pitiful semblance of former soldiers. The big wooden road signs read, Belovsek, Starobelsk. I was walking alone again because the obliging German sergeant had fallen behind on the way. Night had fallen, the wind had increased even more and was now blowing with a blunt persistence worthy of better use. Our faces were again covered with ice masks, and it seemed to me that on my face this mask was denser than ever. 20 kilometers more, according to the German. After an hour, I doubted whether I could cover that distance, so I offered another fervent prayer to the Madonna, only she could help me get to Belovodsk. There were indeed German trucks waiting on the road, though they were few in number. They were now going back and forth between Belovodsk and the village where I had left Antonini, where a German garrison was staying until morning, and not a single Italian truck. Later I learned that one of our convoys, which had been prepared in Belovodsk for the transportation of soldiers coming out of the encirclement, had been sent by the Germans somewhere else. That night, when the German trucks had finished transporting their soldiers, they did start transporting the Italians. But the German drivers were remarkably impatient, and those soldiers who could not be loaded onto the trucks in time for the German deadline were left abandoned in the Numerous firing points were visible on the sides of the road, but now without guns. I tried to guess for what purpose they had been set up here, but could not. My brain was as tired as I was. The column had greatly diminished in size, breaking up into small, isolated groups of people. At times I found myself alone on the road, with not a single living soul in front or behind me. I saw an Italian ambulance and approached, intending to ask to be picked up. I probably would not have been refused, but I thought of the people still wandering along the road in much worse condition than I was, and stepped back. The road was now going downhill. At the very end of it I could see lights. It seemed to be Belovodsk, but how far away it was. The farther I walked, the clearer I realized that I would never reach the town. I wrapped myself more tightly in a blanket and walked, trying not to notice the wind. But it was as if the wind had gone off the Chian. It was furiously rubbing my blanket, tearing the floor of my overcoat. No living creature can survive in such a climate. In the eternal cold, only the cold stars shining in the sky feel normal. And only the great God rules us all, the myriad twinkling stars and the cold too. 3 more German cars passed me. I pulled myself up and tried to climb on the last one. There was not enough strength, and I hung there with my belly on the side while my legs dangled outside. The pain in my stomach was so severe that I had to give up this way of travelling. Once again I was walking down the road alone. I had the feeling that very soon I would not be able to move my legs. Then I would lie quietly in the snow and freeze. But is that fair? Is that possible? After walking so many kilometers, sleeping in the snow all night long, starving. And now that rescue is so close, will I give up? 3 or 4 kilometers before Belovodsk, I saw a sledge slowly driving along the road. They were pulled by 2 exhausted nags who could hardly move their legs. In the sledge were 2 frostbitten Italians and some boxes. I approached the driver, explained that I was an artillery officer, and asked him to make some room for me as I could go no farther. The charioteer replied that the horses were about to collapse from fatigue, and that if the sledge were loaded even little, they would not be able to move it. Not listening to the grumbling of the driver, I climbed on the sleigh, wrapped myself in a blanket, and prepared to make the rest of the way on the sleigh. In a few minutes I was already shaking so hard that the boxes I was leaning against were shaking, and the loud clattering of my teeth, I think, could be heard for many meters around. How I was shaking! We had to stop several times, because the load was spilling out onto the road. Not far from the road I saw a shack that the soldiers had set on fire on purpose to keep warm. Finally we entered the town. An abandoned factory came into view. The driver directed the sleigh there with determination and drove through the open gate. The first thing he did was to unharness the animals. We entered a wonderfully gloomy and dirty room, with neither windows nor doors, and through which the icy wind drove twigs of frozen straw. There was probably a warm room somewhere nearby, but I decided not to demand too much from life. I chewed the last crumbs of galette I found in my pocket and stretched out on the straw, covered with a blanket. My accidental companions were surprisingly generous and brought some more blankets for me from the sled. They also made a fire. Shivering from the cold and high temperature, I fell into sleep. It was the night of January 17. We came out of the encirclement. This is the end of my diary. But our ordeal was not over. From the northeast came the sounds of gunfire. Near the entrance to our frozen room, a ridden nag was struggling in its death throes. I don't know if that horse had brought me to town or if it had brought some other sleigh. I heard through my sleep that quite a number of them were coming. I ended the miserable animal's torment with a shot in the head and dragged myself on foot to look for headquarters. I found out why the order to leave Chertkovo had been given so suddenly. The 19th Armoured Division of the Germans, which together with several M battalions had been trying for several weeks to make its way to the besieged town, could no longer resist the superior enemy forces. Its retreat was not even a matter of days, but of hours. 50 kilometers from Belovorsk to Starobelsk, where the command of the 8th Army was located, I overcame by truck. Soon after my departure, Belovorsk was subjected to a massive bombardment by Russian airplanes, which significantly reduced the number of the lucky ones who came out of the encirclement. On the evening of the same day, January 17, the headquarters left Belovorsk in a hurry, without waiting for all those who had escaped the encirclement to be transported to Starobelsk. Many of them then left together with the Germans, but some of them did not have time and were captured by the Russians. In Starobelsk headquarters, we met with a group of surviving soldiers from Kantemirovka. We learned that Kantemirovka and Milarovo were left at the same time with Chertkov. In the first case, airplanes were used, which at a certain point could no longer land, because the last German troops defending the airfield defeated the Russians, and from Milarovo people went out through a corridor held for them by armoured forces on enemy territory. Halfway between Starobelsk and Voroshilovgrad, we were stuck for a day in the village of Novi Dar because of snowdrifts. There was still a danger of being surrounded again. The mere thought of it was enough to drive even stronger-spirited people than us crazy. I left Voroshilovgrad and took a hitchhiker to the village of Yasinovotaya on the Donets River, a gathering point for the surviving comrades in arms. From here we left on a specially equipped sanitary train to Leopold. Travelling in the train was hardly pleasant. Each sleeping place accommodated 2 people. We were constantly tormented by hunger and lice. In addition, we were constantly in a stinking atmosphere of rotting gangrenous limbs. We stopped continuously and for unknown reasons stood for hours at stations, semi-stations, and sometimes just in an empty field. Many died on the train, including Scott, whom I met in the hospital in Chertkov. Not everyone who wanted to get on this specially equipped train. Many were forced to get off the Donets otherwise. On the passage between Stalin and Krizin, 15 men out of 100, who were the personnel of the battery under the command of Conti, froze to death on the open platform of the train, designed for the transportation of coal. Many died in the hospital at Leopold and on the trains that took us from Poland to Italy. Montresor, my faithful orderly Reginato, and Sergeants Pilone and Breda, who had served with Bellini, never saw Italy. Breda himself frostbitten. On the last day of our stay in Chertkov, somewhere got a horse, gave it to Zanetti, and thus saved the latter's life. Already in Italy, too, Every day someone died. I also had to endure the terrible torture of letters that came from countless mothers, fathers, and other relatives who were waiting for news of those who had not returned. These letters were capable of breaking even the most callous heart. Only a very few of our compatriots who had been taken into Russian captivity managed to inform their families that they were alive. One can imagine the cruel suffering of countless Italian families who for months knew nothing of the fate of their loved ones. Well, such are the mores of the Bolsheviks. In March, I went to Miramar di Rimini to visit Candela, who was in the hospital there. I found him in bed. Both his legs had been amputated a little below the knees. He had also lost part of his nose and most of his fingers and toes. Immediately small, he lay on his back and looked around sadly. Both stumps were raised up and twitched constantly, as if he were still trying to walk.